Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs, podcasts, and a consensus board. He is Mr. Arif from The Athletic. Arif, how was your weekend?
It was a lot. It was
a lot to take in.
It was a lot. Yeah.
How about the board? Did the board survive?
Yeah, the board survived. I've got grades coming out tomorrow, which kind of sucks. I wanted to get them out tonight, or not tonight, but like I wanted to get them out for Sunday morning because that's when draft grades come out. But they asked me to write so many pieces about so many things that to take a while.
Yeah, as it turns out. But overall, the board did well this weekend, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a nuts week for the board, a banner year, I think, because the picks that were selected rarely went off the board. Typically, by around pick 100, there's one or two picks that are not in the top 300 of the consensus board. So I think Quincy Williams from Jacksonville, whatever, I think he went to Murray State, was the college he went to. Or Daron Harmon from Rutgers. He was actually like a top 300 player, but at the time the consensus board was only 200, so he was off the board. Yeah, some of those picks work out. Quincy Williams didn't. Daron Harmon kind of did. I don't know if he's a second round value, but he's certainly a top 100 player. So yeah, it was unusual because it took until around pick 160, or it's actually whenever the Patriots picked the guy, whenever the Patriots picked the kicker from Marshall.
Yeah, was really the top 3% of his class, really.
Ah, boy. Yeah, they picked a decorated in one way kicker from Marshall.
Well, he's a proud boy. To be sure, he should be proud.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, no, you got it.
I can do this all day. I can.
Yeah, apparently it's incredible.
Jeez.
I'm stunned. I didn't think I was, that deep in the internet hole, but I mean, you are reminding me how deep in the internet I am.
Yes. Wow. And let's not forget, the big news of the weekend is that James Madison University quarterback DiNucci was picked up by the Cowboys.
We talked him up.
Uh-huh. Ben DiNucci.
Yeah, he set some passing records in the playoffs, the FCS.
Mm-hmm.
A thing I actually remember I didn't have to look up this time. Scored 60-odd points.
He was great with that running back whose name you can never pronounce or remember, yeah.
Yeah, that guy is probably the real star of the team, honestly. But yeah, Rondell Carter almost got drafted, another James Madison guy. Great year for my Dukes.
Great year for your Dukes.
Yeah. The board did pretty well because the first non-specialist off the board took until like round 5. It was wild. I remember Ian Rappaport tweeted out a couple of days before the draft, "Oh, all your mock drafts are wrong. This year's going to be really weird. It's going to be way different than what you normally see. It's it's going to be a weird year." And everyone just kind of agreed because what about the year hasn't been weird? But it turns out that the weirdness of the year forced general managers to be more conservative or to restrict the size of their board. So because small schools didn't have pro days, we didn't have that many small schoolers. It was a record poor year for small schools in the draft. There's only 9. Typically you get around 20, especially in the later rounds. But as poor as that is for kids who really deserve a shot, it was good for my board. Which put that way sounds pretty callous for me to say, but it did mean that the ability to kind of predict what teams would do based off of the consensus of analysts was pretty good. And the only people that fell down the board in any substantial way, people like Prince Tegoinogo from Auburn, really only fell because of injury, which is stuff the board doesn't seem to usually know. So, yeah, it was a really great year for the board. It probably matched the draft stronger than it ever has. And that makes it pretty good this year in terms of grading. In fact, even the late round picks that weren't on the board were usually in the top 400 of the Excel sheet that I have. And only 2 picks were outside of the top 800, which has never happened in the history of the consensus board. So either I'm getting better at this, which wouldn't make any sense because I'm actually not providing any original information to the board, or the NFL was strangely by the book this year.
Yeah. I can't wait for next year to be like, well, what the hell happened? Like, oh, well, we went back to the way we normally did it. And as it turned out that we only drafted the way we did last year because we couldn't actually see these people. We couldn't do our meetings, and those meetings skew everything. So we couldn't do our own workouts and have doctor visits, whatever. So we were going off the same information the bloggers were. As it turns out, this is what happens when we do that.
And maybe it turns into one of the best drafts ever because of it, or because the talent in this draft was so good. Who knows?
This will be an interesting one to look at in a few years. So welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you are ready for this one to go a while, because we have a record-breaking number of picks to discuss. We are going to talk a little bit about the Aaron Rodgers situation, because as it turns out, the sun may be setting on Aaron Rodgers and on the era of Aaron Rodgers, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow. Ouch. We're also going to be discussing a bunch of mailbag questions. We have a ton of them. If we have to cut some for time, apologies, but we have more than enough to make it through like 2 episodes here. So we have a lot of stuff to go through. Plus, we're going to do some Patreon stuff looking at the NFC North drafts from the Lions, the Bears, and the Packers. The abomination of the Packers draft, as PFF's Sam Munson would have you believe. And he's right, too, but still. So we have all sorts of stuff to talk about, but before we do, just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for telling people about Norse Code, for donating to the show, for helping keep the lights on and help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. We do have 2 new Patreon subscribers to mention briefly. Just want to thank Oliver and Sam for joining up. Again, thank you guys so much. We are providing bonus episodes and content over at Patreon, so if you are interested in getting more Arif Hassan content, and honestly, who isn't, you can go to sorry, I like that. You can go to patreon.com/norsecode. $3.50, giving us a $3.50 a month will get you access to the additional content. We're not doing it every episode, but since we started doing this, we've only missed one. So this is your chance to get more content from us. We'll also be, as the season gets closer, in theory, we'll also be rolling out a Discord as well, which I created that I just haven't done much with yet, and a few other cool things that we have planned down the line. So when we have a season to discuss, we will have all sorts of new stuff to be rolling out as well on Patreon. Or if you just like to do a one-time donation, you can do that over at paypal.me/norsecode. Again, we will be doing a Patreon's subscriber-specific bonus material thing. Yeah, let's go with thing, where we discuss the NFC North in general. But all of that aside, we have a massive haul of draft picks to discuss. Before we talk about the draft picks, what were your thoughts overall on the NFL's presentation of the draft this year, ignoring the tragedy porn that they tried to shove down everyone's throats?
Yeah, good Lord. Ignoring that, they, I think, largely did a better job than we expected. It didn't seem like teams found ways to screw things up in public or entertaining ways, aside from Bill O'Brien, who just got angry that he couldn't complete a draft that the Lions said never was in the works.
Yeah. The Lions said nothing like that was going on, so I don't understand why he stormed off.
So good.
It's just so fun to troll other teams in the NFC North with that. Like between that and the Packers trading up when they didn't need to.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. That's incredible. We'll talk about that. But yeah, I thought that they largely did a pretty good job. They probably should have split up the duties between Roger Goodell and like just anybody else. And I say this as somebody who doesn't.
The end was so good.
He's just like on the floor, basically.
Just like he was. I was slowly but surely waiting for him to like put on like a nightcap and have a little thing of like brandy, just like right next to the thing of M&Ms, just kicking it in the chair, just slowly.
Someone tweeted out that between shots, the bobblehead in the corner moved, which meant that
Ditka
picks you. The Ditka bobblehead.
The Ditka bobblehead was moving. I retweeted that because I noticed
so good.
Oh, Yeah, between that and was it Bill O'Brien or like the GM for the Texans, the guy in the background who wasn't going to the bathroom, it just
the Titans, yeah. Somebody I think was dressed up maybe as Left Shark, and then somebody else was in like some weird all-star jersey.
He looked like Frozone from The Incredibles, which if you haven't seen, you don't have kids, so fine. But he looked like Frozone from the Incredibles. There, it was great.
He was so good. And then the person who I guess was just on a stool, sure, in the background. Oh my God, incredible. But that was like the type of screw up you saw, where it was just like, okay. And, there was like some fun being poked at Gettleman. It turns out like, he put on the mask at kind of a weird, unusual time, and he was in his own house, so people were wondering about it. But, he's there was somebody else in the house, and Gettleman's like recovering from chemotherapy. So it all made sense. But there was like not really that much to say in terms of the process of the draft screwing up. I don't think, teams. So there is the likelihood that we saw fewer trades at the top of the first round because the virtual nature of the draft is more difficult to get trades going. That's probably true. We probably saw, and if you're a Vikings fan, hard to believe, we probably saw fewer trades overall just because of that. So from that perspective, it did kind of change things. It seemed like teams were more willing to like rush to make picks, which we saw probably a little bit of. There's a rumor that that's what happened with the Raiders and Damon Arnett. I don't think I believe it, but yeah. So there's probably stuff behind the scenes that we didn't actually, see. But from the perspective of us sitting here at home, it was run without a hitch. So I guess props to the NFL for that, despite how like weirdly difficult they made it seem. Because it's not that difficult. Like, I don't know how much props I should give it to them, but they made it seem super difficult in the 2 weeks leading up to the draft.
Yeah, and while all of us were expecting some massive problem or some weird thing to happen, likely to the Lions or the Giants, but let's be clear, it could have been the Jets as well. But no, nothing terrible happened as far as all that went. So I enjoyed the format. I, however, really missed the fan aspect of it. Like the noise of like the fans on the TV in Roger Goodell's home aside, which he did find a way to make, the way to make the booing there was annoying as hell. Fine, but and I enjoyed the moment of silence boo tweet I had put out, but but it did lack that, and it felt it. It was more like a podcast than it was the draft as a result of the fan stuff, which fine, people listen to NFL podcasts, right? But it still felt a little weird. So I don't know. I am looking forward to potentially it going back to the old format next time, assuming that seasons and social distancing and whatever goes away, or not seasons, but social distancing stuff goes away. But man, that it was fine for what it was, but it really did feel like it was missing something out of it. But if that's the worst thing I have to say about it, then we didn't really have that bad of a draft. So let's talk about the Vikings draft haul, because there's a lot of them. So let's start off the 22nd overall pick, round 1, Justin Jefferson, wide receiver from Louisiana State University, the national champs.
Yeah, well, he brings with him a ring, so now the Vikings are championship winners, so that's nice.
Obviously.
Yeah.
A win for one of them, a win for one of us is a win for all of us.
Yeah, in the spirit of Norse Code, the Vikings now have won the Super Bowl. But yeah, I think they also won the Super Bowl with Michael Pierce. No, they didn't. It's too bad. But yeah, Justin Jefferson, just like Jeff Gladney, comfortable wearing purple. So great pick for the Vikings from that perspective. But also, really, I think lucky is probably the right word for Jefferson to fall as far as he did. It wasn't like a catastrophic fall or anything like that, but I think the Vikings, they ran a bunch of simulations, as now we all do, and in most of them, or the vast majority of them, Jefferson just does not fall that far. He doesn't usually make it past the Eagles, who have the pick right ahead of the Vikings. So they were pretty happy. The Eagles decided to take like the 5th or 6th ranked receiver, and so the Vikings ended up getting the 4th ranked receiver. When I refer to ranks, I'm talking about on the consensus board. And so I think it's really great for the Vikings, obviously, grabbing a good receiver. But in terms of his fit with the system, I think there are some concerns that, he's potentially a slot-only player where Adam Thielen is best served in the slot. He had over 50% of his snaps in the slot. And so the question is kind of how do you put them both on the field at the same time? And aside from obviously just having like 4 receivers on the field or something, I think you should just be comfortable having Adam Thielen on the outside, and it's not as if Jefferson can't be outside, right? Because it seems like he's like a dog that can't go outside. It's not as if Justin Jefferson can't be a boundary receiver too. He was a boundary receiver for the entire time. He was I think it's a sophomore, right? Because he left early. And he led the team in receiving with 875 yards on the outside with 6 touchdowns and a 16.2 yards per reception average, which implies that he was a little bit further down the field when he was catching these passes. So he has experience on the outside. He has success on the outside. Is he better in the slot? Absolutely. Is Thielen better in the slot? Absolutely. You're going to have to find a way to kind of maximize the talent that you have. But the point of kind of roster construction is not to maximize all of the individual players on the roster. It's to maximize the total number of points that you score as a team. And so sometimes that means making players take on roles where the player themselves is just not going to be an enormous fit. It's not going to help the player in terms of making him look the best that he can look because he has to make a sacrifice so that somebody else can be in a position where you get more total value. And I talk about this all the time when it comes to the draft, but also free agency. Just because somebody's not a great fit for the team or for what you want to do doesn't mean they weren't the best player to acquire in that situation. And I think he was. So is Jefferson going to be capped a little bit or is Thielen going to be capped a little bit? That may be the case. I don't know how much of the case it's going to be. I don't think it's actually that big a concern. But even if it is, I think that the value that you got out of grabbing these guys was really remarkable. I mean, and he's not like a small guy. Like a lot of times when we talk about slot-only receivers, they're small guys. He's 6'1", and he measured in at a quarter inch above that at the combine. He's 200 pounds. He could gain a little bit more weight, honestly, without having to lose much speed. He ran a 4.43. Some people were worried that he'd run in the 4.5s. He had a 37-inch vert. That's really phenomenal. He fits the team really, really well. He's going to be great, I think, on the play action, opportunities that you get where you need kind of the receivers to be comfortable rolling if the pocket is rolling to get into a scramble to really quickly. You want receivers who have the ability to turn routes upfield instead of just out. And he has a history of doing that and the capability of doing that and working with a system that was very comfortable with play action and moving pockets. So that's going to be great. One interesting thing I've noticed is that, so I've brought up a couple of times that in 2019, he was the best contested catch receiver in the FBS, at least in terms of percentage of contested catches caught. And some people, I think most people kind of took it as a positive, but some people took it as a negative. And that's really frustrating because I think people are interpreting a lot of things that people say really poorly. And most of the time that's like on the communicators, but here I think it's just on listening without paying attention to the details. So he's number 1 in contested catch rate, but that doesn't mean he was number 1 in total contested catches. There seems to be this thought that if you're good at contested catches, you won't get separation. And some people in the comments to the Justin Jefferson pieces that we wrote said, I'm worried that he doesn't get much separation or he doesn't get open because he's so good at contested catches, which is just a really mind-bogglingly annoying thing to try and correct. Stephon Diggs is number 1 in the NFL in contested catch rate. No one is worried about whether or not he gets separation. Justin Jefferson gets a remarkable amount of separation, or at least he did at LSU on film. You can say that there's other reasons that you're concerned that he won't get separation. Maybe he benefited a lot from Jamar Chase, a Biletnikoff Award winner on the other side of the field. Maybe he benefited from the fact that the Heisman winner was playing quarterback. Maybe he benefited from the fact that there was a top 3 college offensive line protecting that quarterback. a lot of things he could have benefited from that impact the evaluation. But the fact that he was really good at contested catches doesn't mean that that's the only way he knows how to win. He had 111 receptions this year. So it's unlikely. I mean, he has the single season LSU record for receptions. Contested catch receivers don't do that. If you're good at contested catches, that helps, right? But if that's kind of your bread and butter, that's not where you're going. So yeah, I think that there's some really great stuff to work with. He's a little bit skinnier, so he could gain weight, like I said. He doesn't have 4.3 speed, so he's not going to kind of change the geometry of a defense like a burner might. I've wanted the Vikings to grab a burner for a couple of years just for that effect. And sometimes, his release off of press and the few times that he's had press coverage, his release off of press isn't ideal, which is why you want him in the slot. But otherwise, he doesn't have that many weaknesses. He's really, I think, really quite good. And I think in a different draft class, not a typical draft class. I don't think he's ever the first receiver off the board in a typical draft class, but I think in some draft classes he would be the first receiver off the board, just because there are some weaker draft classes where receiver doesn't go until like 30th, and he's certainly better than those kinds of receivers. So can he be the top receiver in a draft? I think so. I don't think anyone's going to mistake him for Odell Beckham anytime soon, but I think that the Vikings really added a lot of value.
And this was kind of an odd first round with wide receivers because people who were expected to go early didn't end up going until mid to late. And then the ones that we were expecting to go, the ones we expected to go early definitely didn't end up going early. And the Cowboys ended up getting a hell of a deal.
Yeah, the Cowboys benefited a lot. I mean, they had probably the best draft of anybody, but they benefited a lot from the way the positions shook out, and the Cowboys needed those positions that fell, and they took enormous advantage of it. They got CeeDee Lamb to play opposite Amari Cooper. That's the dream. That's amazing. And Michael Gallup is on the team too. That's a really phenomenal scenario for them. So yeah, and it's really interesting. The Eagles it seemed like the Eagles didn't really take advantage of it because they could have gotten Justin Jefferson. That would have been a big coup for them. Instead, they put an enormous priority on speed. And Jefferson is not, there's a concern that he's not actually a 4.43 guy, but Jefferson's certainly not like a 4.22 guy, like Jalen Reagor is rumored to be. He didn't run that, but there's a rumor that that's typically what he can run. And last year at the junior pro day, he ran a 4.29, so it's there. But yeah, you expected San Francisco to take a receiver there. They waited. They grabbed Javon Kinlaw, which that makes sense too, honestly, to replace DeForest Buckner, who they traded away. And then they waited to get Brandon Ayuk later. So, I mean, that all makes sense, right? But it did mean that you had receivers fall. The Denver Broncos were always going to take a receiver. Every single person essentially gave them a receiver with that pick. That's what they ended up doing. They ended up getting a steal. They got the 8th ranked player overall on the board at 15. That's always pretty good, especially if it's at a position of need. And then from there, you ended up with like just this cascade effect where receivers just kind of fell down the board. And the Vikings were just in a really remarkable spot where they were able to grab somebody because, offensive tackles went early, because Javon Kinlaw went to the 49ers, and so on.
And unfortunately, Justin Jefferson is going to end up getting compared to Stephon Diggs for the majority of his career, or at least the first couple of years, because of his unfair association with Diggs leaving. And then the first thing we do is pick up a wide receiver, much in the same way that when Randy Moss went, his replacement never had a chance.
Yeah. I think part of it is because we were a little dumber about that sort of thing back then. Just like the media landscape kind of encouraged that sort of thinking. But, Troy Williamson was the marquee player from that Vikings draft. And here the Vikings just have so many picks, and they had 2 first rounders, and, it's difficult to have a marquee player. I don't think we'll see as many comparisons to Stephon Diggs. I think it's fair to say, hey, I think the Vikings would have done better in this game if they had Stephon Diggs instead of Justin Jefferson. Maybe unfair to Jefferson, but fair for the Vikings. And so that's going to happen. But luckily, I think we haven't seen much of it yet. We'll see when the season starts. The thing that's fairly unfortunate in that regard is that he does play a lot like Stephon Diggs, which is also to say that he plays a lot like Adam Thielen. They have very similar games, at least in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. They look a little bit different on the field because the way they run routes is a little bit different, and Diggs ran deeper routes this year, but ran much shorter routes the year before. But they're fundamentally, from a strengths and weakness standpoint, very similar receivers. And the only reason Justin Jefferson is not completely similar to them is that both of them are really great off the line of scrimmage, releases against press. I don't think there's a better receiver in the league at releases than Adam Thielen. And so, the comparison's not 1-to-1. It never is. But Justin Jefferson is very similar to them in a lot of ways because there's just not that many slight receivers that are basically a mid-sized receiver, 6 feet tall, not 6'4", not 5'8", that are really remarkable route runners that are also great at contested catches. That's just not a profile you see a ton of. But both Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen fit that profile, and they aren't like Tyreek Hill where they'll run a 4.3 or a 4.2, and Justin Jefferson is. So, and Justin Jefferson is like that group of people because I think Thielen ran a 4.49 at one regional combine, and that's the one that's listed on DraftScout. He ran a 4.42 at another one. Stephon Diggs, I think, ran a 4.43. Jefferson runs a 4.43. They have very, very similar, profiles, and I wouldn't be surprised if Jefferson had run a 3-cone, that they would be very similar to the fast 3-cones that Thielen and Diggs ran. So, in that respect, there's probably going to be a comparison to Diggs, but I think people are a little bit kinder about that nowadays than they used to be.
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. I usually don't have faith in people, so this is a weird step for me.
This is not a time to have faith in humanity. I'm sorry. But we can talk about the second pick that the Vikings made, round 1, 31st overall. Jeff Gladney, the first cornerback that the Vikings picked up out of Texas Christian.
Yeah, well, I think the Vikings would not have picked a receiver at 22 had one not fallen. I'm curious if they would have picked Gladney at 22 instead. Instead, they trade back, which is why I'm curious, right? Because if they picked him at 25, you would have said, yeah, they would have just picked him at 22. They're not similar necessarily in terms of value, but the calculation is probably pretty similar. But the Vikings decided, hey, this is kind of where we value Gladney, or where we expect him to be, and it's just really interesting because, of course, the Vikings had already had all the draft picks in the world, so they trade back. I thought that the trade back was pretty even value. I ran it by a couple of boards, and I think by the classical Jimmy Johnson board, the Vikings lost about 4% value, and by the Chase Stewart trade down board, they gained about 4%. So it's kind of in the middle between both of them, or the Rich Hill board, I should say. By the Rich Hill board, by the Chase Stewart board, they gained 17% because it's always very friendly to trades down. So. Yeah, it was a smart trade in part because everything they expected to happen happened, unless they were really set on Noah Igbinoghene, who went to the Dolphins for some reason, who already had 2 corners and drafted the 7th ranked corner for whatever reason. Unless the Vikings were set on him, they got exactly what they wanted. So Gladney is. It was clearly their target. I have heard that the Vikings were also pretty high on Damon Arnett, and I suspect that the decision was between the both of them. I think the Vikings were not going to leave the first round without a cornerback, but with C.J. Henderson gone at 9, and he was valued around the 16th overall pick, so that's another thing that kind of pushed the receivers down. But with C.J. Henderson gone at 9, you ended up with A.J. Terrell, who went to the Falcons at 16. My sense is that the Vikings were kind of interested in Terrell. Then Damon Arnett at 19, and then no corners went until Noah Igbinoghene. I just love saying that name now that I know how to pronounce it. Went to the Dolphins, and the Vikings got Gladney at 31. So really, I think pretty good value considering that they thought of Gladney as a first-round corner. By the board, it was marginal value. They gain a little bit just by the fact that it's a position of need and it's a high-value position. But from the perspective of just the player, yeah, I like him a lot. He's somebody that I've talked up. I've mocked him into the Vikings a couple of times, once in the first, once in the second. And He's a little bit undersized. The Vikings clearly care a lot less about that now than they used to. But everything else kind of just checks out. The real question is if, like Jefferson, he's going to be kind of stuck in the slot. So the thing that really appeals, I think, to Zimmer about Gladney is that he's really good at press coverage, which is the opposite of what you want in a nickel corner. But everything else just kind of makes you kind of worried about that. He doesn't have deep speed. He's not a 4.3 guy; he's a 4.48, and he doesn't have insane quickness. He's got really good footwork, and that gives him lateral agility, but turn and run agility is different, and he doesn't really have like a ton of that. And his so he makes a ton of contact, which is mostly a positive. But when he does make contact and it occurs deep downfield, it tends to draw penalties a little bit more often. So that's the question: whether or not you could have him on the outside when there's some struggles with big receivers. But the things he's really good at profile really well on the outside and pretty well at the nickel. So his ability in press is honestly the best press corner is the other one that they drafted early on, who I don't like, but I'll say from this perspective, a really remarkable press corner. But Gladney is up there as a really remarkable press corner. He's got good recovery speed, so his initial acceleration from like 1 to 10 is really good, even if he doesn't necessarily have deep speed, which gives him recovery space. He does a really good job taking runners down, just because he's a really aggressive tackler. He does wrap up when he tackles, but primarily he does it with speed and contact, so he has the ability to take people down. But mostly he's just extremely physical. He's physical at the line of scrimmage. He's physical throughout the route, which is really great to see because you don't see a ton of Big 12 corners doing that. And he moves receivers off of their route path, which we get to see less and less of in the NFL as they enforce rules. But the ones that do it really well and do it without drawing penalties are really making the most of what they have. And that's how players like Richard Sherman and Darrelle Revis were able to extend their careers so long, despite not having a ton of deep speed, especially Sherman, who never started with a ton of deep speed in the first place. Like Revis lost a lot of it, but Sherman never had it. So the fact that they've been physical throughout the route and moving receivers off the route path without drawing penalties too much. I mean, Sherman kind of also revels in drawing a couple of penalties, is really great because it lets you overcome the speed issues. And then, of course, they're physical at the catch point. And that's what Gladney does really, really well. We've gotten pretty used to Vikings cornerbacks, and not just Trey Waynes, but Vikings cornerbacks going back to 2010, kind of being in position and then not doing anything about it when the ball arrives. I remember that being a problem with Chris Cook. I remember that being a problem with A.J. Jefferson. I remember that being a problem a little bit with Asher Allen, although he got burned a little bit more than that allows for. But it's been an issue in the Vikings cornerback group for a while, and it was an issue with Trey Waynes. Not as bad as those other guys, but it was an issue with Trey Waynes. This is not the kind of player that Gladney has demonstrated to be in college, and he's very comfortable challenging the hands of the receiver as the ball arrives. So that's going to be kind of fun to see. And he just like gets into it. I mean, it's been an issue. He's been kicked out of games, or I think just one game for targeting. He's an extremely emotional competitor. I think the Vikings are kind of used to having that. But he's really tough. And then one thing to keep in mind is that it's easy for me to say, hey, his turn and run agility isn't all there, but he did play through a meniscus injury all year, and he didn't have it repaired until March, so like a month before the draft. In high school, apparently he tore an ACL and LCL. That doesn't seem to be an issue, but that's something to keep in mind as well. He's got pretty remarkable ball skills. He has 30 pass deflections over the past 2 years, 15 in each, which is only true of him and Amik Robertson in the FBS. No one else has done that over the course of 2 years. So I really like the pick. In terms of pure value, maybe you could have traded down a little bit more. I gave this round an A- because I still do like Christian Fulton more. I think he's a better corner. I think he fits the Vikings a little bit more as well. He's more versatile. The NFL obviously disagrees. He fell all the way to, I think, like 79 or something. So clearly Fulton was not in the NFL's estimation that guy, but I do think that he was that guy. So A- instead of an A because I liked Fulton more. But for the most part, the Vikings got better because of this pick.
Do you feel like this was something that, well, I mean, the first thing that the people think about when it comes to the Vikings as far as draft needs are concerned isn't necessarily wide receiver, and it may not even be cornerback. It's the terrible offensive line. And many fans were justifiably annoyed that offensive line wasn't necessarily handled until the second round, but was there somebody for offensive line that you would have taken in either of these picks?
Among the offensive linemen, I would probably take Josh Jones, which obviously would have been a mistake because he falls all the way to the 90s, I think, if I remember correctly. But the NFL was not nearly as high on Josh Jones. We had a guest onto the show, Ben Solak, who ranked Josh Jones 138th, so he was not high on Jones either. But there were a lot of people that were high on Jones, including like offensive line specialists. So I'm not too broken up about the fact that I disagree with a bunch of people on that. But taking a look
72. Pick 72.
72. Okay, yeah.
Cardinals.
But taking a look at the cornerbacks that went after 25, so including the fact that the Vikings traded out of it, what are their opportunities? Isaiah Wilson, I would not have taken in the first round. In fact, I put money down that he would not be drafted in the first round. Did not get that money. But I still made money, so I'm happy about that. But the other offensive lineman, Robert Hunt, I probably would not have taken. He goes 39 to the Dolphins. He was the top-rated guard in the consensus board, but he was still ranked basically as a low second-round pick. So the fact that he went in the high second round was not great. No other offensive linemen go until Ezra Cleveland, it looks like, unless I'm missing something. Wow. Okay. Well, I guess we can't make that talking point too easy.
Yeah,
I would not have taken Robert Hunt or Isaiah Wilson. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about him. Let's go round 2, 58th overall. Ezra Cleveland, offensive tackle out of Boise State.
He's pretty good. He compares so cleanly to Brian O'Neill. It's just lazy, right? Like for me to do this analysis, just like it was kind of lazy for me to compare him to Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, but again, I don't think there's a ton of receivers with that profile. I've written a piece on Ezra Cleveland and his analytical profile. It hasn't been published yet because we're kind of waiting until May because no one's going to have anything to do, so we want some content there. But quickly, from an analytical perspective, he compares very, very strongly to Brian O'Neill. And so it's not just me being kind of weird about it or being Vikings focused. He's a guy that if he had been drafted in the first round, like with Brian O'Neill, if he had been drafted in the first round, I just would not have been excited. I just wouldn't have thought that was a good pick. And I was concerned that the Vikings were interested in Brian O'Neill heading up into that draft because I was concerned they were going to draft him in the first round. So grabbing these guys in the second round, I think is really great value. Both of them are really remarkable athletes. That's a big part of it. Both of them have some issues with strength, particularly core strength. And core strength is maybe the most difficult thing for a football player to improve over the course of a short period of time. And so that's going to be difficult to resolve. There's like other kinds of strength that are not as difficult, but in terms of like building up, your arms and your legs, it's a little bit easier than your core. So it's going to take a while for him to be a complete tackle from that perspective. But he was a pretty good pass protector in college. He wasn't like stunningly good. He wasn't as good as Josh Jones or Matt Pert or even at the top of the class, Andrew Thomas and Jedrick Wills, who are both probably the best pure pass protectors in this class. But he's a really good pass protector, and he's much better than someone like Isaiah Wilson or Robert Hunt or any of the other kind of tackles that a lot of people were potentially talking about in the second or third round. So he's a pretty good pass protector. In terms of run blocking, he just doesn't have a ton of push as a base blocker. But when he gets to the second level, he does a pretty good job kind of identifying his target and kind of moving forward. So that's all pretty nice to see. But for the most part, the thing that you're interested in, and I ended up pressing Solak on this later, he kind of just doesn't like developmental tackles, period. Like he just doesn't like them. He had Isaiah Wilson ranked low. He had Ezra Cleveland ranked low. He had Prince Tega Winogo ranked low, and he didn't even know about the Winogo injury, or rather he didn't take into account the Winogo injury that much. And I think the only person that he ended up having ranked kind of high was a younger guy, because younger guys have more excuses for not being maybe it was actually Winogo, but he had 3 or 4 developmental tackles, including this guy, Ezra Cleveland, ranked pretty low. But history indicates that if you're a super athlete and not just an athlete, that matters on the offensive line. The top offensive line athletes mostly include fairly good players. Evan Mathis and Brandon Brooks at guard, Lane Johnson at tackle, Trent Williams at tackle, who, by the way, he actually athletically compares to both of them pretty well. It's difficult for anyone to compare to Lane Johnson because he had like an all-time combine, but people in like the top 20 of offensive line athleticism over the past 15 years, like 8 of them turned into pretty good players. And then you've got Leiden Murtha, who was on the Dolphins for like 2 years. That's about it. In 2001, Ryan Diem was drafted. He was the most athletic offensive lineman in my database up until that point. And he didn't turn into a superstar, but he played 150 games. He was pretty good. And a couple of other guys that once they got into camp demonstrated that they were worth rostering longer than you typically roster. So I like it. I think that the athleticism kind of gives you a window. It's best to be a super athlete, obviously, but if you're a very good athlete, that doesn't help you that much. It's only until you get up into this range of being kind of a super athlete like Ezra Cleveland is, that you get into a situation where you can really say that this person has a ton of upside to develop, and he's got that. He's got to do some more work in regards to footwork. He's got to do a little bit more work in terms of his timing on his punches, but for the most part, the Vikings expect him to be able to contribute right away. I'm a little bit skeptical just from a strength standpoint, but from everything else, I think that he's a pretty good player.
Well, the next player that was chosen was in round 3, 89 overall, Cameron Dantzler, who is also a cornerback out of Mississippi State.
Yeah, I don't love this pick. The problem is I say I don't like this pick, but then I take a look at everybody who goes after Dantzler in the actual draft, and I don't like any of those guys, and I'd much rather have Dantzler than the guys that came after. And so that tells me that he's the bottom of this tier of players, which is where he ends up getting drafted. And among those tier of players, he was my least favorite. I'll say it. Slow corners just don't do that well. They just don't. So there's this concern, right, that he's not actually that slow, and that his tape shows that he's actually a fairly quick receiver. And I know Luke Braun tweeted out a video of him kind of covering a route that goes deep downfield to the outside and kind of staying in phase and getting a pass deflection off of it. And then there was also that video of him at his pro day running a 4.38. And then there's the fact that he was a high school track athlete, and, this, that, and the other thing. And it's a really complicated story. It really is. Because I ended up going into kind of a rabbit hole, and I wrote a piece that will also be published probably in May on Cameron Dantzler and just what a weird profile he has and all of the weird stuff that goes into trying to figure out how fast he is. I ultimately concluded that he's probably a 4.55 kind of guy, which is fine. Again, that's like Richard Sherman, right? But I don't love some of the other flags I'm seeing. So he weighs into the combine 188. In his press conference / Zoom call, he says he's up to 190. But he also had the highest body fat percentage of any corner at the combine, which is a good indication that he added bad weight in order to weigh in at 188, which is maybe a reason that he had a poor combine performance too. And the thing is, it's not just that he ran slowly. Like, there's the claim that he injured his right quad and he pulls out of other workouts as a result of it. But he still actually performed the vertical jump. And he only got 34.5 inches on the vertical jump. And that's a really big concern as well. And he ran twice. And if you injure your hamstring on the first run, you're not going to get a better result on the second run. And you're probably at some risk of re-injury. That's why they shut you down when you injure yourself, so you don't re-injure or aggravate the injury that you have. And if he was hurt enough to shut down the rest of his combine, he probably was not hurt enough after the first run to do a second run. So that implies that he ran and got injured on the second run. But if that's the case, why did he run a 4.64 on the first run? Right? Like, so that's kind of confusing too. He ran 2 runs and they were 4.64 and 4.65. And there's probably not a timing issue here because, he runs in kind of the same group of cornerbacks where you had someone go under 4.3. At the time, the fastest cornerback that had run a 4.42. And so it's not like a timing issue. He ran twice. So I don't know. It's very concerning. But the biggest issue for me is the weight. At 188, that's kind of the heaviest he's ever weighed. He showed up on campus at 165, and they just tried getting him to gain weight again and again and again, and it wouldn't really stick. And so he played, I think, at 180, and it just feels like his body wants to revert to like a 175-pound frame. That's just what his body wants to do. And that happens. Like, with Matt Khalil, for example, his body just wanted to be lighter than it was. And he would often play the season at 280 pounds, even though his official weight was like 300. And so Dantzler is somebody whose weight concerns in the other direction than we usually say weight concerns are a problem. He doesn't have a ton of body armor, right? He'll get bullied around by receivers and not just the big ones, like maybe average size receivers. Like I'm imagining, somebody with his frame trying to go up against Stephon Diggs on a contested catch. It doesn't look pretty, right? And so those are my concerns. Now, in terms of what he looks like on film, again, you've got a confusing story. So the people at PFF like him a lot. A lot of draft analysts like him a lot. And the thing they point to is they say, hey, he shut down Jamar Chase, which again, an 1,800-yard receiver, 1750 or something like that in college, Biletnikoff Award winner, really incredible receiver. LSU had this weird problem where they had 2 first-round quality players on their team, and it was like the freshmen that were better than them on the other side of the field in cornerback Derek Stingley and in receiver Jamar Chase. So it was kind of weird. But okay, he shut down Jamar Chase. One analyst said that he allowed only 6 yards to Jamar Chase. The other one said he only allowed 20 yards to Jamar Chase. I think PFF said 20 yards, 4 targets, 2 deflections or something like that. Really great. And Chase ends up with, I think, 70 yards in the game, which is the lowest he's had in an LSU jersey that year. So great. But if you take a look just at his total statistics for the year, they're not that great. His yards per route run allowed is about average. His success rate, I want to say, is one of the statistics I was looking at, is about average. His forced incompletion rate, his completion rate allowed, all of that is about average. When you give points for interceptions and take points away for touchdowns, he ends up about average. The one thing that he has a really high rate on is ball hawk rate, his ability to get his hands on the ball, which is just kind of like Gladney too, where if it's within radius, he does have a good chance of getting his hands on the ball, and he has one of the highest ball hawk rates in terms of like pass deflections and interceptions of almost anyone in the draft class. And that's really great to see. But that implies that on those other targets, he's getting kind of burned. And he allows a lot more yards than he does completions, which either implies that, people are targeting him a lot, which it turns out is not the case, or he's allowing completions to get further downfield, and that seems to be the case. So statistically, his production is not that great, but the film guys love him. And like I said, he's one of the best press corners in the draft. I mean, he just tries to beat up receivers a ton. He just gets right in their pads, and he really does a good job disrupting the routes. It's just kind of everything else. I mean, he's fine in terms of his assignments in zone and knowing what he needs to do in terms of who he's got to pick up and stuff like that. He's all right when it comes to, bullying receivers throughout the route. But the weight concerns are an issue for me. Sometimes, he earns a pass deflection, we should get an interception because he was late to the ball. And then sometimes he allows something that should be a pass deflection to be completed. But that's a little bit difficult to criticize too much given his production there. And he's not a very good tackler as well, which is what you'd expect. So I don't love this pick, but I also don't have like an alternate option for the Vikings here, just because the corners that go after him are not that great. Aside from Amik Robertson, who I would have loved to have, except for the fact that would mean that the Vikings only have one corner above 6 feet on the roster, and that's Holton Hill. So you know that there's going to be games he's just not going to be available because he's going to get suspended. So you needed a taller corner. I mean, you can't rely on him being available. You just can't. I would love to be wrong about this because I like him a lot and I think he's really talented. But there's no way the Vikings can go into the season saying, when we go up against 6'4" receivers, it's going to be that guy that we're definitely going to have for 16 games. Like, that's rough. This was not a pick that the Vikings traded out of, so it's not as if you can say, hey, they should have picked this guy before they traded down. Maybe they should have traded up and gotten Michael Ojemudia, who I like a lot. Not a ton, but I like a decent amount. That would have been, I think, a better pick. Or maybe instead of Ezra Cleveland, Christian Fulton, which again, I like Ezra Cleveland, but apparently Josh Jones could have been had. So it's tough because I don't think the Vikings had a ton of options here. And I think given the options they had, they probably made the right choice, but I am not optimistic about his prospects.
The idea, of course, being that Zimmer wanted his corners, and by God, he got 2 of them in the first 4 picks. Round 4, number 117 overall, DJ Wonnum, defensive end, South Carolina.
Yeah, so I criticize this pick too, and when you criticize 2 picks in a row, people think you hate the draft. I like this draft. I don't like Wonnum as a pick. I'm sure he's a fine person. In fact, it sounds like he's a great person. One of only 3 people ever selected to be captain as a sophomore in South Carolina's really extensive football history. It's extensive because they call themselves the original USC. He's okay, great. He's a leader. People love him. He's a good person. I don't know that he is a particularly great pick. And something needs to be said here about deferring to Andre Patterson, which I think on the Athletic podcast, someone was like, or Chad was like, well, I mean, what do you do if you're Spielman? And like, honestly, if Andre Patterson walks up to me and says, that's the guy I want, I'm your defensive line coach, and this is the guy that I think is a steal. I'm worried that he won't be available later. This is the guy I want. And you're Spielman, and you look at the guy that developed Daniil Hunter and Ofadi Odenigbo and actually turned Hercules Mata'afa into kind of like a reasonable option for a couple of weeks, and did a great job with Tom Johnson. You look at that guy and you go, I don't think you know what you're talking about. Like, you can't do that. So you draft the guy and you trust your defensive line coach to be a good defensive line coach because he's proven that he is. So I get all that. That aside, I don't think that Wonnum is a particularly great pick. His frame is very reminiscent of Daniil Hunter's, which I think was a difficult point to kind of get out, right? Because when people would say that, they'd say, well, he's not Daniil Hunter. Or if you didn't say that, somebody would be like, well, what about Daniil Hunter? And so you're just kind of stuck in this place where now I think that's the bigger risk, that he's going to get compared to Daniil Hunter more than Justin Jefferson's going to get compared to Stephon Diggs. But Wonnum is like an average athlete. He's not a bad athlete, but he's like an average athlete. I know that when I said that, somebody was like, well, I think, what did he run, like a 4.7 something? But somebody was like, well, he's not an average athlete. He ran pretty well. But in terms of weighting the athleticism metrics for what's important, which is something I've done for a couple of years now on a fairly regular basis to kind of take a look at what matters, he ran a 7.25 3-cone, and that's the most important drill for pass rushers. Okay, I just looked it up. It looks like he ran a 4.73. And at 258 pounds, the 4.73 is 0.03 seconds faster than average. So about an average athlete. Great 20 split, really poor 10 split. Whatever. His broad jump was pretty good for his size, so that's nice. But in terms of agility, he just doesn't have it. So I would say, negative on agility, positive on explosiveness, about average in terms of his run speed. So that to me is an average athlete. He's got really long arms, 34.25 inches. He is 6'4" and 5/8. And so from that perspective, you compare to Daniil Hunter. But Hunter's one of the best athletes we've ever seen test at the edge defender position. He tested better than Khalil Mack. He tested better than Jared Allen, who tested, obviously really well. I think he tested better than Everson Griffin. Like, he tested incredibly well. It's like J.J. Watt and Von Miller, and that's like it. There's like not a ton of people that tested better than him, and Wonnum tests as an average athlete, and so to say that they're comparable is not useful at all, and that's why I'm more concerned about his production than I was with Daniil Hunter's. I wrote at the time that the Hunter's going to take a while, but if he gets the right coaching, he's on an Everson Griffin career path, and the only reason that's wrong is because he's even better than that. I don't see the same thing with Wonnum. And maybe I'll watch a lot of film and change my mind, and I'll do that. I've got film breakdowns coming for all 15 of these people. But for right now, I don't see it. His production, his pressure rate was only 8%, and Daniil Hunter had a really nice excuse, which was my coach was asking me not to rush the passer. That's a pretty good excuse, I think, in terms of why didn't you get that many sacks. I don't think that that's what was happening with Wonnum. He was asked to rush the passer. He didn't do a very good job of it. That 8% is on the lower tier of SEC edge defenders. And that's a concern of mine. He's an average athlete with poor production. Can you draft that in the 7th round? Yeah. Can you draft that in the 4th round? I don't love it.
And right around now, there is all the business with the Saints ending their draft day, basically, and trading all of their picks over to us, which led to round 4, pick number 130, James Lynch, defensive tackle out of Baylor.
Yeah. Who did the Saints end up picking anyway? That is such a weird...
I believe it was a tight end.
Well, that's dumb. All the tight ends in this class suck.
That was kind of funny.
Adam Trotman. Actually, no, that's fine.
Yeah, it was kind of funny to watch they did end up picking up a quarterback in the 7th round, but it was Adam Troutman out of Dayton.
Actually, of all the tight ends to trade up for, actually that one does make sense.
Yeah,
the Dalton Keene pick by the Patriots, like 3 picks before that, was just not that good, and then they picked Devin Asiasi before that, also not good. Troutman's fine. Anyway, to the Vikings, the first pick that they acquired from the Saints Hall, which tracks in the Vikings' favor just from a value perspective, it just is exhausting because now you've got more people to cover. Lynch was maybe my favorite day 3 pick. Probably. I think that Lynch did a really amazing job at Baylor. I watched him a couple of times for some mock drafts. Played on the edge, played on the inside, primarily on the edge, and led the FBS in total pressures produced, just outright. 90 pressures produced per PFF. I think 70-odd pressures produced by Sports Info Solutions. Both of them say that that's the most in the FBS last year. So pretty clearly a pressure producer. I read one comment that was like, I don't like the pick because he seems like a run stuffer. And I'm not like upset that you don't know who this guy is. He's like a 4th round pick. That's fine. I'm like weirded out because I want to know where you got the idea from. Because like someone told you that, or you watched it and that's what you came to, or you read a scouting report and that was your conclusion. Anyway, that was weird. That comment also said that he was not that great of an athlete, which again, I don't know how you come to that conclusion necessarily. He's certainly an above average athlete, that's for sure. The question is whether or not he's a very good athlete or just a pretty good athlete. But yeah, I think that the only thing that concerns me about this pick, at least in terms of where the Vikings got him, was, obviously they think of him as a pass rushing 3 technique instead of an edge defender because he just doesn't have the size or honestly the tools to be an edge defender at the NFL level. So for example, his 3 cone was 7.39 seconds slower than DJ Wonnum's, right? But the thing is, the amount of athleticism you need at tackle is way different. It's just different, even at the same weight. And so that is when you move into defensive tackle, the same athletic scores end up looking a lot better. And he profiles as a pretty above average athlete in that regard. A 4.93 40 for somebody who was at 290 pounds. That's pretty great. A 4.39 short shuttle. That's pretty good. A 7.39 3 cone at that weight is all right. And so the only thing you're missing is the vertical. And at least in the broad jump, he did pretty well there too. I think, what was it, 9.3 or something like that? pretty good for a defensive tackle. So a pretty good athlete and a remarkable pressure producer. The only issue is that I don't think that he actually did all that well when he was lined up inside for Baylor. And so the question is, if you're going to move him inside, why was he on the 100 odd snaps that he played on the inside? So not a small sample size, but not a large one either. Why wasn't he very effective? Why didn't he generate pressure when he was on the inside in the way that when you moved to Neil Hunter, Everson Griffin, or Brian Robinson to the inside, they just kind of wreck people's days? Look, why wasn't Lynch doing that if he's the pressure leader? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but the Vikings will need to know the answer. And so the benefit to having Patterson there, of course, is that he can figure out kind of what works best for him and what doesn't, and try to tailor what Lynch does to solving that problem. And maybe the focus on playing defensive tackle as opposed to playing every position along the defensive line is going to be pretty big for him. But yeah, I like the pick.
Next up is going to be Troy Dye, round 4, number 132 overall, linebacker out of Oregon.
Yeah, the Vikings always take a linebacker on day 3 every single year. The only year they didn't do it, they technically still did it. It was Stephen Weatherly, who's a linebacker at Vanderbilt. Obviously, he's an edge defender, so you can't count it. But I think in the Spielman era, going back to 2005, I want to say they've done it every single year except maybe that one year. Out of all the linebackers that they've picked at the back end of the draft, he's I think up there. I think he's one of my favorites. I liked Michael Mauti a lot more. Who didn't? But other than that, he's a pretty good guy to grab. I think that the question for him is, is he really a safety because he's like playing at 220 pounds, a little bit less than that sometimes, or can he be kind of a full-time linebacker? Which, I mean, the Vikings answered that question with Eric Wilson with, yes, he can play full-time linebacker, and you ended up with a really good backup as a result. The thing is, the reason the Vikings always take a linebacker at the end of the draft is not because they're always lacking in linebacker depth. It's because they use these guys and they value their opportunities and roles on special teams. And so the Vikings grabbed him to refill and revitalize the special teams unit first and foremost. And then, he's actually a pretty good player on scrimmage. But yeah, his profiles as a really excellent special teamer because he's got a lot of speed. He doesn't tend to miss a lot of tackles. In fact, I think he's got one of the higher tackling efficiencies in the FBS. He's got a lot more power than you'd expect out of his frame, and he does a good job defeating blocks. So he profiles as a pretty good special teamer. The Vikings lost, I think, their 3rd and 4th largest snap getters on special teams, aside from like the kicker and the punter. So they've got like Amir Abdullah and Chris Boyd, who were 1 and 2. But then after that, they lost like Kentrell Brothers, and obviously they lost Andrew Sandeo, who, if you did it on a per game basis, got a ton of special team snaps. They lost Marcus Epps because when they signed Andrew Sandeo, they cut him, and Epps hit waivers, and the Eagles basically just picked him up and swapped him for Andrew Sandeo. And so the Epps Sandeo combination, their role on special teams, that's lost too. And Ben Gedeon and Eric Wilson only have a year left on their contracts. Wilson because he signed a tender, and those are only 1 year, and then Gedeon because he's at the end of his rookie contract. So I really like it. I mean, like, I like having Cameron Smith on the roster. Watching him in camp, he performed a lot better than I expected, and so that's good to have. But you did lose Kentrell Brothers, and you did lose some special teams capability. So this guy's pretty good. And the thing is, a lot of people see him as kind of a coverage-only player, and so it's kind of a clone of Eric Wilson, and I don't really see that. I think Eric Wilson is much better in coverage, but Dye is a much better run defender than Wilson, and he's a much better coverage player than Ben Gedeon. And so Gedeon is one of the better kind of run stuffers that play that third linebacker role in the NFL right now, and Wilson is one of the better coverage defenders that play the third linebacker role in the NFL. And Dye is not nearly as good at either of them in any of those things, but he's better at their weaknesses than they are. And so that's going to be kind of the question going forward is, for that third linebacker spot, do you value somebody who's potentially elite at the thing he does in the very, low value kind of role that you fill, or do you get a guy that can't be that as easily exploited? And personally, I would go with get Eric Wilson because coverage is so important, but I totally see the value in having that guy on the roster for sure.
All right, next up is going to be yet another corner. Round 5, pick 169, Harrison Hand, cornerback out of Temple.
Pick 160, nice. Yeah, this pick was kind of confusing. I think he's like fine. I think in terms of like his talent and the pick value, I think they match, right? So I think that he's about as talented as where he went. He has got some crazy hops. He got 41 inches in the vertical jump, 11 1-inch broad jump. So there's an athletic element there. You know, his agility scores were not great. His 40 wasn't great. His 20 was actually pretty good. But, you know, he's not a super athlete, but he's got one dimension of him that's really crazy athletic. But, you know, he obviously for a guy that goes here, you know, you're expecting somebody that's not necessarily going to be all that great in the first place. So, you know, he does have issues with quickness that show up on the field. He doesn't have great recovery. He doesn't win at the catch point all that often when he's contesting. You know, if you profile him in the slot because he's 5'11", he doesn't have a ton of experience there. But, you know, otherwise, you know, I like his ability in press, which has kind of been a theme for the Vikings in this draft. He's got good agility coming out of press. You know, he's a pretty smart corner. That's kind of one of the important things about, you know, if he's not athletically there and if he doesn't have all the technique down, he better be smart. And he is. He's got awareness and he does a really good job kind of diagnosing what's happening in front of him. And he's not a bad tackler either. So I'm fine with the pick. There was some like rumor that maybe not rumor, but like there was some talk that, you know, maybe the Vikings were considering moving him to safety, which I would have been fine with. But like then they like just drafted 2 safeties after him. So it's a fine pick, but they like could have gotten one of those guys that fell really far in the draft instead and just tried to get a steal and kind of get a luxury pick out of it, just because they had so many picks. Personally, this is where you select Bryce Hall. Because if he doesn't pan out, you've already drafted 2 corners that you're pretty confident have the ability to start. And if he does pan out, you've got like the scariest depth in the league in terms of defensive backs, at least for that year. So I think Bryce Hall would have been a really inspired choice here because you've got the insurance of the other picks and you've got just tremendous upside. Here, the upside's not necessarily there and his production is fine. He's a pretty skilled corner that's got kind of the baseline talent that you need, but you know it's just kind of a confusing pick. I'm like fine with it, but like there's some missed opportunities here.
Yeah. Round 5, number 176 overall, KJ Osborne, wide receiver out of Florida, Miami, Florida.
Yeah, don't love this pick. So they drafted him because he's a returner pretty clearly. It's the first thing Spielman said in the presser. And he is a really good punt returner, like top 5 in the FBS last year in punt return average. Not a bad kick returner either. And what's interesting about him is that he's just never been a good receiver. So he was the second receiver to Tyree Jackson in Buffalo, opposite Anthony Johnson. And so, you know, he had a lot of opportunities there, but when Tyree Jackson declared for the draft and Anthony Johnson went as well, he decides to transfer to Miami. It's essentially a free grad transfer because he graduated, which is great. But he gets worse. You know, at least statistically, he's got fewer receptions, fewer touchdowns, fewer yards. I don't love that. And he's kind of an older receiver that has had a lot of time to improve at the craft, and he just hasn't improved at the craft. So I just don't see kind of receiver potential there. But he is a pretty good returner, and a ton of returners went right before this pick. 2 went actually between this pick and the pick they had right before it, before they traded out of it, which is interesting to me. But they lost. They could have either grabbed L'Jarius Sneed earlier, or they could have grabbed guy, I forget his name, like Darnell Motley, I think. Mooney, who was really good returner prospect. Donovan Peoples-Jones, I think, is a slightly better receiving prospect and a slightly worse returning prospect, but he's somebody that I would consider there. Joe Reed from Virginia was an electric kick returner. So a lot of people that went before the Vikings could pick that kind of forced their hand, at least they think here. But I don't love the pick. He's just not a very good receiver. And so now you're just getting a punt returner. And I think you can just kind of find those guys. Like, it's difficult, right? Not a lot of players can become punt returners. But I don't know if I would have spent this pick on him.
Round 6, 203 overall, Blake Brandel, offensive tackle, Oregon State.
He was rated really low on the consensus board, and so it looks like a pretty bad pick, but I actually don't mind it. I like the philosophy behind a pick like this, which is if you're like elite at one thing, there's a really good chance that you'll kind of bear it out in the NFL. If you're an elite athlete, there's a pretty good chance you'll be a good athlete in the NFL. Not a good player, but a good athlete, right? Compared to your peers. If you're, elite at something, you'll probably be pretty good in the NFL. He is a remarkably poor athlete, but he ends up with the best pro football pass protection grade in the FBS, not in the draft class, in the FBS. And that kind of holds true when you only look at quote unquote true pass sets by PFF. And so those are the 3, 5, 7-step drops that require that, the ball gets out a little bit later, that aren't kind of a lot of the college quick sets that you see, and put the tackle on an island. So those are the reps that they grade as true pass sets, and he actually looked really good in that according to PFF. So productive guy, and so there's maybe a decent chance that will translate. Now, if you're just a prohibitively poor athlete, that's all you are. That's not going to help, and you'll get drummed out. But I think for a 6th round pick, getting a guy that's really good at the job you're going to ask him to do at the NFL, whether or not that translates, who knows? But I think that there's a pretty good philosophy behind this pick. I don't expect him to pan out. I never expect 6th rounders to, but I think that the Vikings improved their odds pretty well here.
All right, next one up is going to be a safety. Finally get a safety out of this. Round 6, 205 overall, Josh Metellus, safety out of Michigan.
Yeah, pretty decent pick. Maybe I wouldn't have picked him, but I can't really complain about it. The thing I like about him is how he improved every year in college, particularly in this final year where he became a really good run defender, where that was an issue for him in previous years. And that's a really difficult thing, especially for a safety, to suddenly add to their game, because you usually have it or you don't. And so the fact that he added it to his game, I think, is really good, and it speaks to his ability to become a developmental prospect. I like that. He's about average in terms of speed. He's about average in terms of agility. But you can play him in the deep middle without being as concerned. I know a lot of people don't like him in the deep middle. I'm fine with it. I think that he can kind of perform there. But the thing that's really interesting to me is that he's basically Marcus Epps. They were just like, well, we don't have him, but we want him. And so his strengths and weaknesses are very, very similar. He's a little bit better against the run than Epps is, and Epps was a little bit better at play diagnosis and stuff like that. But otherwise, it's they're adequate against the run. They've got good range, really great instincts. They know how to get to the landmark quickly. When the ball arrives to them, they can contest it. So he's basically Marcus Epps. So I understand the pick. Yeah, and I think that there's value here. Probably would have made a different pick, but that's like a B plus or something like that in my book.
All right, so now it's the first of the 4 round 7 picks, which is an absurd thing to say, but here we are. Number 225 overall, Kenny Willekes, defensive end, Michigan State.
This is the guy that I probably would have drafted in the 4th round instead of won him. I really like this pick. So credit to the Vikings for waiting this long or appropriately understanding his value and grabbing him where they could. He did have a walk-on offer at Minnesota and he turned it down, so I'll hold that against him. But he is from Michigan, so I guess I get it. So he's a guy that you take a look at his measurements and you say, hey, he's got kind of a small frame. I wonder if that's going to bear out. 31 and a quarter inch arms, that's not great. 6'3" and a half, that's not great. And then I saw him at the Senior Bowl and you see him live and you're like, oh, that dude's really small, which is funny, right? I'm 5'4", but he was standing next to some 6'8" dude. So it was very easy for me to say that. But yeah, he just looks crazy small. He's a walk-on. When he walked on to Michigan State, they tried him out at middle linebacker, fullback, and tight end. I have no idea why they tried him out at tight end, but they tried him out in those positions. And in his redshirt freshman year, so after his redshirt year, they moved him to defensive end on the scout team, which I I don't know if that was like out of desperation or if he wanted it or if they liked his combination of traits and decided to do it. But apparently he killed it and he earned a starting job and a scholarship in 2017 and became third team All Big Ten. So he's been really fairly good since then. He led he was one of the he led the Big Ten in tackles for loss in 2018 in his redshirt junior year, and then obviously his redshirt senior year he continued a high level of play. 16 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks, and he just kind of produces. He's really productive on a per pass snap basis. Not crazy productive. I think an 11%. Pass rush rate, which you compare it to Wanham's 8% is a pretty huge upgrade. You compare it to somebody like Curtis Weaver, who PFF has a first round grade on, but a lot of people consider it as a second round prospect. He had a 15% pressure rate, which is really high. So he's kind of in between the two in terms of pressure rate, but he also just didn't leave the field. He had 470 odd pass snaps. He was just on the field all the time. And so that tends to decrease your pressure rate, but it does not tend to decrease your total pressures. So you usually lose pressures somewhere in the middle there because you're tired or fatigued or you're saving your best moves for third down or whatever. The same thing happened to Jared Allen. His pressure rate the year he got 22 sacks was like fine, which is just weird to think about. But he got pressure when it mattered, and I think Willikis was kind of in a similar situation where he kind of had to pick and choose his battles because he was on the field so often. So I expect his production is not a completely accurate reflection of him, and it was actually still good production. So that's good to see. Another character guy. So this is as good a place as any to point it out. So he was a team captain and the team MVP. The Vikings drafted 16 captains, including Wanham and including Willikis. And Spielman said the reason for that is it's really difficult to get a read on a guy if you can't talk to him. And because they didn't have top 30 visits or local visits or have the ability to go to a pro day and have dinner with a prospect, because they just couldn't interact with them in person, they decided to hedge their bets from a character perspective and grab guys that there wasn't really much question on. Guys that they wouldn't have talked to anyway, kind of like Eric Hendricks, who they never talked to because he was a completely clean evaluation. And so the Vikings decided to avoid character risks, not because of a team philosophy, although I'm sure that plays a role, but because they couldn't determine what the true risk was when they wouldn't have the ability to talk to somebody. And so they got a bunch of team captains, including Kenny Willikis. So the thing about him is that he earned actual awards at Michigan State for being the hardest worker on the team. He added 40 pounds since he arrived, and he had like 31 straight games of production. Like he just did not miss games. And like I said, he played a ton of snaps. Surprisingly powerful player for his size, but just doesn't have a ton of length. There was concerns that he didn't have a ton of bend, and the fact that he has a 7.39 3-cone is a pretty decent indication that he doesn't. I got to see him play with bend at the Senior Bowl, so I'm kind of curious if that's something he can unlock. But, he doesn't have a great speed to power transition. It's mostly just power. He doesn't have a great inside move, and he doesn't have levers to make a ton of different pass rush moves. But he's got a really good intuition for how to get past a pass protector. And he's got, apparently there's just an insane motor, which is not difficult to believe based off the other things you hear. So his chase down capability is really great to have. So I really like this pick a lot. I think, like I said, if you can gamble on something, gamble on an elite trait, whether that's production or athleticism or something else.
Well, here's the person who should take over for Kirk Cousins once his contract is over. Here's the flyer. Round 7, 244 overall. Nate Stanley, quarterback out of Iowa.
Yeah. So like any, day 3 quarterback, he's bad. That doesn't mean he's a bad pick. He's just bad at playing quarterback. That's fine.
Is that going to be the name of your piece on The Athletic when you eventually have to release something on Nate Stanley sometime in July?
Well, I mean, actually, that's not bad. We'll see. Well, because you could just be like, Nate Stanley's a bad quarterback, and that's fine. Is a fun headline. We'll see if I can get away with that. So when I wrote that Chad Greenway piece, I didn't have any editors. Can you tell?
No,
but,
why would that be? Why would that be a thing all of a sudden?
But yeah, so the thing with him, I'm saying this a lot. The thing about X Player is, so regarding Stanley, I would say that the reason that he is a draftable prospect is because you only really have to fix one thing. A bunch of bad quarterbacks can be bad for a bunch of reasons, and taking the time to try and fix all of them is just really difficult. And so sometimes the high upside athletic quarterbacks with a big arm have all kinds of problems. They're not great against pressure. They can't read defenses all that well. They don't anticipate where they need to throw the ball. They have poor accuracy. Okay, great. Those are the 5 things you got to fix. Great. Well, at least he can run fast and throw far. With Stanley, it's really just that he can't hit the broadside of a barn. He's just not very accurate, but everything else is like there. He's got, which, normally that's, we see that guy drafted in the 2nd and 3rd round, but it's really bad. Plus he's not an athlete. So, that's why you wouldn't see him get compared to Josh Allen anytime soon, but he's got a really strong arm. And he does really well in terms of dealing with pressure. He either does a good job kind of anticipating it and getting rid of the ball, or standing in the pocket and just taking the hit as he's throwing the ball away. He does better on 3rd downs, which is good. He does a great job kind of reading defenses, especially pre-snap, which is kind of the Cousins thing. Post-snap, he's actually kind of fine reading defenses too. The issue is his mechanics are kind of the whole reason that he's just not that great. And then he also can't make up for it with a ton of athleticism. I think Brugler said he moves like he's wearing ankle weights, which is great, cool. I don't know how to fix that. So he's just going to have to be a statue quarterback, which is fine. But he's aggressive and he's got the arm to show it. He just can't get the ball there. And so he's been working with a mechanics expert, and now that the Vikings have drafted him, the Vikings will be working on his mechanics. And in a couple of years, that might be fixable enough for him to be kind of a tantalizing developmental project. So I am fine with this pick. I think that there's something there to work with. It's not like the last Iowa quarterback they got, the guy I keep wanting to call James Vanderbeek. James Vandermeer or something like that. It's just like too close for comfort to an actual celebrity. It's not like Mitch Leidner. It's not like the Wisconsin. Man, it's a lot of Big Ten quarterbacks. You should probably look into that. It's not like the Wisconsin Joel Stavey, where it was just like a bunch of problems. It's like one problem. So yeah, I'm fine with it.
All right, next one on the list. We're just about done, folks, I promise. Is going to be a safety. Round 7, 249 overall. Brian Cole II, safety out of Mississippi State.
Yeah, so he played corner at Mississippi State, but like you said, the expectation is that he'll play safety in the NFL. Crazy athletic, at least with the ball in his hands as a returner. I would have liked to see him return the ball more often. They didn't give him all the opportunity in the world to do that. But he ran like a 4.5, I think, at the combine, 4.52. But with the ball in his hands, he looks really kind of electric. So he only has 2 interceptions in his career, and he's only got like 8 or 9 kick returns in his career. So you just don't get to see a ton of it. But he did average 20.6 yards per return. I expect him to compete directly with Osborne for the kick return spot and hopefully also the punt return spot. But he's got tools. He's taller. He's got a little bit of length. His wingspan is 75 inches. Is not bad. And so he's got those tools to work with. As a man coverage corner, he got lost a lot. And so, I mean, so when you turn on a Mississippi State game to watch Cameron Dantzler and Brian Cole, it's very different and weird. Dantzler's like beating people up, and Brian Cole is like trying to find the gas station. It's like way different. It's interesting. He hits probably about as hard as Dantzler, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. Like, Dantzler, maybe he weighs 175 pounds, but he just like hits people really hard, which is nice. His nickname in high school was the Needle because he was skinny and he hurt. But it's literally a story he told. But Brian Cole also does a pretty good job, hitting people. He's got a lot of power in his tackling attempts. And so having him move to safety is fine. The only issue is that one of the issues that he had as a corner was his inability to kind of read the patterns of the routes and figure out kind of where to undercut routes and drive on throws. So he didn't always do a great job in that respect, and that will probably translate to safety. But kind of the other stuff, like the man coverage stuff, was not. That's the stuff that you're concerned about. The other elements of zone coverage he seemed to have down. So I'm kind of interested in how he can perform, especially as a safety as opposed to a corner.
And finally, pick 253 overall, Kyle Hinton, guard out of Washburn.
Yeah, this guy's a super athlete. 295 pounds, ran like a 4.8 40 or something like that. So compared to the rest of the tackles in this class, I think there's only two guys who ran faster. That's Tristan Wirfs and Ezra Cleveland. And so he killed the rest of his workouts, so he did a really good job. At the 3-cone, the short shuttle, etc. And he actually got a fair amount on the bench press too. So really great. And this was not at the combine; it was at his pro day, and he was kind of lucky to be able to hold it because it got him drafted. He's pretty athletic. The concern is that he was not the best tackle in Division II, and if only one Division II tackle is going to get drafted, he should probably be the best one, right? He was second-team All-American instead of first. You don't tend to see those guys get drafted. Only half the first-team All-Americans in Division II get drafted, if that. So like your Kyle Duggar types or whatever. And he didn't even make that. And so the issue here is probably his ability to deal with power. He's 295 pounds. He probably overpowered a good deal of people in Division II, but every so often somebody comes up that's like, you're like Ben Barch, but a defensive end. That's tough. I'm going to have to deal with that all day. Great. And so he'll get beat up against power and stuff like that. He's probably going to move to guard, which is kind of funny given the issues I just pointed out. He's going to have to develop, but he's just this crazy good athlete. So like I said, if you grab someone late, bet on an elite trait of some sort. It's why I didn't love the Wanham pick. It's why I like the Kyle Hinton pick.
And the Vikings were able to, speaking of future stuff, the Vikings were able to get a couple of picks that they had this year stockpiled and going into next. So we're not in a terrible position moving into next year's draft either.
Yeah, no, they got a couple of picks. They got, obviously they already acquired the Buffalo 2021 pick. But then, was it the third round that they traded down with the Saints? No. Did they get a future pick from them? They didn't get a future pick from them. They just got the rest of the Saints draft. But they traded to Chicago for a future 4th-round pick as well. So that's 2 future 4th-round picks. And then what did they get? Like a future 5th from Baltimore? Yeah, they got a future 5th from Baltimore by trading 2 7th-round picks. So they drafted 4 players in the 7th round, and that still includes trading away one of those picks. So they traded 2 7ths for a 7th, a much later 7th, and a future 5th. So really good job. They have like 3 4ths and a 5th, in addition to the 3rd-round pick and a compensatory 3rd-round pick, and I think maybe a compensatory 4th-round pick. So they've got a ton of picks next year as well.
Yeah, this is looking good for the Vikings, at least moving forward into next year's draft as well. Now, of course, this isn't the only signing news that the Vikings have after the record-breaking number of draft picks they were able to bring in. There's also a number of undrafted free agents that we can discuss.
Yeah, for sure. I'll run through the ones I'm a little bit more familiar with real quickly. So Brady Aiello, offensive line, Oregon. 6th offensive lineman, fairly athletic. He, obviously the reason that he's an undrafted free agent instead of a draft pick is because he spent, I think, all 4 years at Oregon as a 6th offensive lineman. But the amount of talent that they had on that offensive line, including a couple of draft picks, people like Calvin Throckmorton, great name. He didn't get to see the field all that often. And so you end up in a situation where, you don't really know what you have. He could be a 6th offensive lineman for the Vikings. He was recruited, I think, as a tight end, but for the most part, he was just kind of a fill-in. He's been smooth. He has a fairly decent technique. He doesn't have the greatest physical profile, but he still has like 33-inch arms. He still ran a 5.15 at 307 pounds. He still jumped 9.1, which is just below the Vikings cutoff at 100 inches. So mostly like a decent athlete. Not great agility stuff, but he did all right. It's kind of like evaluating Rashad Hill. He did all right. So he's probably not going to end up making the team, but he's somebody I was familiar with because I had to do a lot of deep dives in the offensive line. Also, Neville Clark, cornerback, Central Florida. He's one of the two, I think, high value undrafted free agents. He actually played alongside Mike Hughes. He's a guy that is a lot like the cornerbacks they already drafted, a little bit bigger. He's 6 feet tall, almost 6'1", 190 pounds. And he's got a pretty decent wingspan of 76 inches. It's a little bit longer than the Brian Cole. So, he's a 3-year starter. He was pretty inconsistent. He chose not to run the 40 at the combine, and maybe that's a little bit telling. But his movements are generally fairly fine. He just he tends to get really aggressive, whether that's because he's like grabbing jerseys, or because when he's hitting, he doesn't wrap up as a tackler. And as somebody who just kind of like flies around, he doesn't do a great job, generally actually creating that much of an impact when he hits people. So he doesn't have as much hitting power, but for the most part, he does a good job getting to the ball. The Vikings have clearly prioritized guys that get a ton of pass deflections. He had a ton of pass deflections. I mentioned that Gladney had a lot at 30. He had 28 over the last 2 years. And so he's kind of interesting. Again, like I said, inconsistent, doesn't seem to have that much agility, but then you take a look at his numbers and he ran like a 6.88 3-cone. So the agility is there. It might be because he's playing too upright, or something along those lines. But he doesn't play necessarily to his numbers. You'd want to see a little bit more from him, but there's something to unlock maybe with a better coach that can get you kind of everything you need. And then also he just needs to have a little bit more eye discipline. But he's got a lot of size, a lot of great instincts. He does a really great thing with regard to screens, is that he can suss them out really quickly. He does a great job on returns, like on returning interceptions, and I'd like to see him kind of return in camp as well. So a lot of ball production, just kind of worried about whether or not his athleticism translates, which is why he went undrafted. But I think there's some potential there. Safety Miles Dorn, another like multi-year captain, this time with North Carolina, also super inconsistent actually from game to game, but he's supposed to be super smart on the whiteboard. It doesn't always show up on the field, but he's supposed to be super smart on the whiteboard, and he's somebody that I've like drafted to the Vikings like a number of times. He's somebody that, I think that he's like, I think he got elected captain. He's somebody that, like, whenever you read a scouting report on him, it's always like, man, everybody loves this guy. So it's kind of another one of those guys. But for the most part, he had a bunch of injuries early on in college. I don't know if he passed his medicals, but he's active, and he's got like a pretty good understanding of what he needs to do. It's just sometimes he's trying to do a little bit too much. He gets out of position. He's not great at taking on blockers, and his medicals are. I think he had 2 surgeries after his junior year, and so that's something that you have to worry about because he already had issues with quickness. But for the most part, really good hitter, really good understanding of how to disguise coverages, really good understanding of how to undercut routes and stuff like that. It's just sometimes he's just kind of way off the mark. And so you'd like to be a little bit more consistent. And then I think finally, so there's a bunch of guys that they got, but the final guy that I think people are really excited about is Courtney Davis from Texas A&M. I understand why he wasn't drafted, but as a 6'1" guy that has the ability to go up in the air and grab the football and contest it, there's a lot to like. The problem is he just doesn't have the ability to get open deep. He plays slower than his tested speed of 4.54. He's got a decent amount of agility, but you just kind of expect him to do more downfield, which he didn't. He only had 2 receptions of over 25 yards, and so he just profiles as a big possession receiver. And he did all right with that, but he did have a number of drops on tape. So not a ton there to project in terms of his eventual role, but does really great against press. You don't see that a ton in college. He's a really explosive player in terms of his ability to get up and contest the ball in the air. He's a really explosive player in terms of his ability to get to his top speed, even if it's not that fast in the first place. And he does a really great job boxing out cornerbacks. So there's something there. There's a way that he can win. But he's undrafted for a reason. You have concerns about injuries early on in his career, like all these other guys. But then you also just don't know if he's got the top end speed to really be kind of a real backup. But yeah, I mean, those are the four guys that I know the most about. They also signed Dan Chisena, wide receiver from Penn State, Jake Bargas, tight end from North Carolina, Jordan Fair, linebacker, Appalachian State, which had like 3 players go in the draft, Nakia Griffin-Stewart, tight end from Pitt, Tyler Higsby, a Michigan State offensive lineman, Jake Lucina, offensive lineman from Augustana, a local guy. I think a local guy. Blake Lynch, linebacker from Baylor, not related to the James Lynch that they drafted, and David Moa, defensive tackle from Boise State. So it seems like a really good class. People seem excited about it. Usually when I'm excited about an undrafted free agency class, they turn out not that great. And when I'm not that excited, they surprise me. So take my words with a grain of salt there.
You're trying to temper your excitement. You're trying not to be overly excited because you know that will doom them.
Yeah, that's it. I in theory would be super excited about Courtney Davis, but I was also crazy excited about Corey Robertson. Who's Corey Robertson? Great question.
Head over to the Google machine to find out what he's doing now, because it's not football, sadly. Okay, so we have our undrafted free agents. The biggest news that came out of the draft wasn't the number 1 pick, wasn't the number 5 pick, wasn't even that the Lions decided to ignore all trade offers and pick somebody with and pick Okudah. Had nothing to do with anything like that. The biggest news out of the draft world this weekend was that Green Bay drafted a quarterback in the first round nearly, 15 years to the day that it happened to with Rodgers and Favre.
Phenomenal. My 2 least favorite quarterbacks got replaced in the draft this year.
It was amazing. The fact that I wonder how good the Eagles are going to be now that they have a quarterback on their roster.
Yeah, I'm really excited. They finally got a winner. Somebody that you can trust uses athleticism without getting hurt. Really great stuff.
All right. I've got 3
great anticipation thrower.
I've got 3 quick listener questions that we'll touch on briefly. But first one is from Sarah. Not a Vikings question per se, but in what world does the Green Bay drafting strategy make even one bit of sense? I'm delighted, but very confused. Professor Poop asks, how much of a catastrophic poop disaster was that Packers draft? And Noah B asks, will Aaron Rodgers mentor Jordan Love like Favre did to him, or will Rodgers treat him like family?
Jesus, Noah. Oh my God. Wow. That's a spicy question. Yeah, okay. So here's how bad the draft was. So my model that uses the consensus board to grade the draft, which is nearly done, I really screwed that up, is all right with a Jordan Love pick. It's not a fan, but it's like mostly all right. They're like, okay, technically you needed a quarterback because they didn't have any backups, and quarterbacks are a really high value position, and he was a quarterback that was ranked in the top 50 of the consensus board. So it was actually kind of fine with that pick, and it still made the Packers like the 3rd worst draft in the NFL. Like, if you were like, let's get the Jordan Love talk off the board, let's, whatever with that. The rest of the draft was also a catastrophic disaster. They grabbed a fullback in the 2nd round. They grabbed a fullback in the 3rd round. I am stunned.
Yeah.
I can't, so they were like, all right, so this Josiah DeGuara guy, we see him as a Kyle Juszczyk kind of guy. Which is always what you say about a guy that you draft in the 3rd round, is I think he can be the best at his position. That's definitely like very believable. But I think he had like a 6th round grade on the board, and I mean, he had like 39 catches in college as a senior. I shouldn't say career, and 500 yards. And it's just like, well, I mean, that's kind of like what you'd expect from Juszczyk in a particular year in the NFL. Like at Cincinnati, like shouldn't he be doing a little bit more? What do they play? The AAC? Like I feel like you should be doing a little bit more. He was downgraded by a lot of people because he's kind of between fullback and tight end. But he doesn't really have the kind of strength that you'd expect from a fullback. So, yeah, I don't know, man. They got like 3 guys that are not going to contribute to the passing game. And the thing is, it's not like Jordan Love's a good quarterback. Like, Jesus.
So here's the best part about this whole thing. To me, anyway. Just actually, the best part is that this does officially mark the setting of the sun. This does mean that Aaron Rodgers' time in Green Bay does appear to have a deadline on it. But Ian Kenyon tweeted out, by the time that Aaron Rodgers' contract is tradable or cuttable, Green Bay will be deciding if they want to exercise Jordan Love's 5th-year option. You put yourself in this position. This is your fault. 100%.
Just incredible that's where they put themselves.
We've talked about this recently with the idea, like when we were talking about the CBA, and we were talking about how this, and it's not even comparable between the two scenarios because the old CBA was still in place when Rodgers got put in, and the new CBA, which places far more value on the rookie pay scale. For a quarterback, like it's not even comparable at this point. You are putting the most valuable thing in all of football, which is a star quarterback, on a rookie deal, and Aaron Rodgers is arguably incredibly overpaid for the fact that he's declining, but this is insane.
Yeah, I love it. It's remarkable.
It's
and the
beautiful.
Thing is, like, we talked about this with like Cousins, right? And we were like, well, if they draft a quarterback, what are you going to do with Cousins? If you draft a quarterback in the first round, that's kind of dumb, right, Arif? And I was like, well, I did it in the recent mock, and here's the explanation: is that that guy gets to play by year 3 of his contract, like, or I guess year 4 if you're really that concerned about Cousins' guarantees in the 3rd year. But at least you get him on his rookie deal, right? And you develop him then, and like. Cousins is not Rodgers, right? Like Rodgers, you're going to give a ton of latitude towards, and Cousins are just like, you got to prove it to me next game. All right, good job. Prove it to me next game, right? Like there's a reason that he's got an unstable position in the NFL. It's like, with Rodgers, it's like, yeah, he must be dying. Holy crap. And like, there's like a no trade clause. Cousins has a trade clause, right? Has removed his no trade clause, I should say. I think there's a no trade clause with Rodgers, or if you do trade him, you take on like a $60 million cap hit.
Yeah, the dead money is astonishing for that contract. Even for like a younger quarterback, this is obscene. This is I love it. I want to marry it. I want to disappoint it for the rest of my life. Like it's so beautiful. This is just, and the fun part has been watching Packers Twitter and Reddit and all of that just go nuts, because they have spent the last 2 years telling anyone who would listen that Aaron Rodgers has not dropped off. Aaron Rodgers is just as accurate as he ever was. Aaron Rodgers is still a top 3 quarterback in the league. And now they have this dropped in their lap. And if this was a result of like management looking at him with his beard this last month or so and like getting scared, like, oh my God, he actually is getting old, or just something that they want to get their, like, this is their team and they want to be able to do they want to like have their fingerprints all over the team. This isn't McCarthy's stuff anymore. This is our stuff now. Fine. But man, you couldn't have waited till next year. Like, You went to the NFC Championship game. You got stomped. You couldn't stop the run. Aaron Rodgers couldn't complete passes to complete passes. But like, you went to the NFC Championship game. there were things you could have done here, and instead you decided, I don't know much in this world. I do know that you don't upset your quarterback that you're paying way too much money is obviously a once-in-a-lifetime talent, despite the fact that he's incredibly annoying, and I wish we'd never play him again. But like, you don't do this. This is... Even Gettleman thought this was dumb as hell.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't grab a nose tackle. Yeah, so yeah, like you said, it's a team that they themselves are fairly convinced, at least I thought they were fairly convinced, that they're on the verge of winning, right? That they're on the verge of grabbing another Super Bowl ring, conference championship game and all that, right? With the Vikings, you could say, hey, they're blowing it up. They lost like all these guys in free agency. With Rodgers, you're just like, and the Packers, you're just like, yeah, they're about to get over the hump. Just get Rodgers a receiver, which, by the way, didn't do that. But get Rodgers a receiver, maybe kind of improve the O-line a little bit. And you can rely on how talented that offense is going to be with just one more receiver to pair with Devontae Adams and just a little bit more kind of insurance along the offensive line, because you really like your running backs. You've got Aaron Jones, you've got Jamal Williams. That's a great 1-2 punch, and you can grab kind of like a third running back to help you out kind of later on in undrafted free agency and so on. So get that offense set, invest in the defense, make sure that you can support Darnell Savage and Jair Alexander. Maybe you can get a little bit more out of Kevin King, but if not, maybe you grab a guy, maybe grab a linebacker. They've always had issues at linebacker. Maybe kind of support Darnell Savage with a depth pick at safety, make sure that you've got insurance for Rashawn Gary, right? Because he hasn't really done much yet. Maybe he's not going to develop. Maybe you should grab a backup defensive tackle. And they decided to get like a fullback and another running back that is basically a fullback and a quarterback that's not going to play for 4 years. So they did not get better and may have gotten worse. I'm not sure. It's tough for a team to get worse because of the draft, but the Packers sure are trying.
Yeah. Dov Kleinman tweeted out, in 2018, the Packers gave Aaron Rodgers a 4-year extension worth $134 million that had a $57.5 million signing bonus. They decided his play declined so much, they took a first-round quarterback only a couple of years later. Rodgers has $31 million in dead cap in 2021. 31 million. And if this is a situation where the new coach and new GM wanted their fingerprints all over it, I can't remember who had tweeted it out, but somebody had said that it's clear that the two of them watched the first 2 episodes of the Bulls documentary, The Last Dance, and decided that Jerry Buss was the hero.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Good, yeah. Good Lord, man. Also, it's Jordan Love. Like, he's not accurate. He's not a good decision maker. He regressed in 2019. I understand there's like a different offensive coordinator, and I know that plays a pretty big role. He doesn't have a good understanding of the pocket. It kind of just collapses a little bit too easily for him, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. He doesn't have actually all that great a frame, just in terms of being able to take on hits. He like throws the ball to the other team. That's like not great. That's like disqualifyingly bad. He's not good. And then they're like if they had grabbed like Tua Tagovailoa, right, with that pick, right? Like let's say Tua falls because of medicals, and they grab Tua. I honestly think it's great. Like I think that's fine. Like Tua is not going to be able to play for a couple of years anyway because he fell that far because of medicals, which implies that at least in that universe, he's not going to be able to be good to go for a little bit.
Yeah.
But he's a great decision maker. Maybe he wants to add some weight, but he throws with anticipation. He's got accuracy, and he can take over, I guess, in 4 years. So maybe I don't love it, but I like it. But then you have to help Rodgers because you've not helped the team with your first round pick. Like you gave the Saints Marcus Davenport for nothing. Like, do something, right? And they grab a running back with like 21 career catches, 7 over the last 3 years, right? Each year, 7 catches and 4,000 yards rushing. Like, clearly he doesn't catch the ball. He only knows how to run it. Yeah, he ran like a 4.4 at 240 pounds. That's really incredible. I wrote about how much I would like the Vikings to draft him in the 7th round. They grab him in the 2nd round, Aaron Jones is only under contract for 1 year, I guess, and they don't want to pay him. Okay, fine. Grab like a good running back then. First of all, don't grab a running back because they're not that valuable. Second, don't grab a running back with the anticipation that you're going to need him 2 years out. Third, how much is Aaron Jones going to cost you? Nobody really cares about him. Yeah, he led the league in touchdowns last year, but he didn't make the Pro Bowl. And I don't think the Pro Bowl is a good indicator of talent. I've talked about this a couple of times, but it's very clear that like a bunch of people don't know who he is or care about him. He's very talented. He might be better than Dalvin Cook. I don't know, maybe. But I don't think he's going to demand a huge contract. And if he does, draft a running back that year. They don't take that long to get ready. Like you run the ball. They know how to run the ball. Like if they can't pass protect, they might not see the field. That's what happened with Jeremy McNichols in Tampa Bay. But like they have the shortest learning curve of all positions. So wait until you can't get Aaron Jones and then grab a guy who knows how to catch the ball. So yeah, they didn't get a receiver. They got a running back. They got a fullback. I'm surprised they didn't just draft another long snapper like they did a couple of years ago before it was cool. And that was in the 5th round. At least the Vikings drafted theirs in the 7th.
Yeah, this has just been so much fun to watch. The absolute deterioration of the fan base going, well, but Rodgers has been fine. Rodgers has been great. Why are they trying to replace Rodgers? I don't understand. I've been told
invested so much into this truth that Rodgers has been just really phenomenal.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah, huge win for Ben Baldwin. Banner day for him.
Even Justice was like, "What the hell?" Like, it's just been so fun to watch, to enjoy. I really hope there's a season this year just to watch the fun in Green Bay happen.
They did make one good pick. It was pick 242, Jonathan Garvin, defensive end. Other than that, every single pick that they made was a negative value pick by the consensus board.
And this year, it's really hard to argue with the consensus board. So,
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
I don't know what to tell you there.
Good job, idiots.
Yeah, that's fun. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to switch over to Patreon to talk about the rest of the NFC North. So if you are a subscriber to Patreon, this will just go right into it. Otherwise, we will be returning to go right into the mailbag. All right, we are going to go right into the mailbag now, and our first question is actually going to be from Kyle Slaby, who asks, how long of a coma is Arif going to fall into once his recap article and podcast is finished?
Well, I was going to write my recap right after the draft, and I had so much to do. I had to write I had to contribute blurbs to 2 national articles. I had to be on 3 podcasts. While we're recording, I actually accidentally double scheduled this podcast for another one. So I sent an apology while we were recording. And I had to write 2 other pieces. I had to write so much. Yeah, I'm going to die. But I did go to bed against my will.
Did someone force you to go to bed, or did you go to bed on your own, like of your own volition?
No, I fell asleep in the chair, so neither.
You were rocking that Roger Goodell, late.
Yeah, he was transmitting his energy to me, which is not great.
I had joked that he looked like me in the middle of like a Saturday XFL game that didn't matter, just like slowly but surely, like waking up partway through. Oh, that's what the score is. Good. All right, back to sleep. Let's go to Raul, who asks, does college durability correlate with NFL durability? My hypothesis is no. Has this ever been studied?
Yes, but not by me. I don't know. My understanding is that it does correlate, but the question is usually, so for team doctors, when they make these decisions, they don't ask like, how many injuries did this guy get? That's my grade, right? Which I'm not saying that that's what people are assuming that they do, but that's to frame the fact that they look at each injury individually, see based off of like the X-rays and the scans and all that, whether or not there's lingering damage from those injuries. and whether or not they've injured the same part of their body multiple times. So if you injured your shoulder, then your ankle, and then you've got like a sports hernia or something, that's 3 injuries that might take you out of a number of college games. But they might not even mark you as an injury red flag because these are injuries that are not likely to repeat. Maybe you just got unlucky, and they don't impact each other. Right. Sometimes injuries impact each other. And so even though they're not the same injury, they're kind of marked that way by a medical staff that's evaluating the likelihood of future injury. So, for example, Greg Childs never really had the same injury. He had an ankle break in one, an ankle sprain in the other. And then because of the ankle sprain, overworked one knee, and that's what snapped his patellar tendon in college. So he goes undrafted, goes to the Vikings, and then suffers a bilateral patellar tendon tear. So he never had the same injury, but because of his ankle injuries, he was putting more stress on his knees, and that led to the likelihood of that tendon getting weaker, which of course led to it snapping. So there is a relationship, but it really depends on the injury, and every doctor does treat each case individually based off of the information that they get about the case. So there is an indication that college injury availability does correlate, but probably not in the way that people think. And so if you get a bunch of injuries in college, sometimes you still go in the first round, and that's happened. If you get one injury in college, sometimes that injury is bad enough or you just didn't recover from it in enough time or some other thing, and you get pushed from the first round to the fourth round. Which I think Dominique Easley only had like one injury, and he was going to go in the third round if the Patriots didn't take him at the bottom of the first or something like that. So yeah, I think that it really is. You probably get a weak correlation if you just run games missed due to injury versus games missed due to injury in the NFL. It's probably a weak correlation. But in terms of the people projected to get injured again, there's probably a relationship. And we actually got an email, I think, from Bill Botke that asks an interesting question about this too. I don't have it in front of me, but he basically asks, hey, if you've got a bunch of consensus board data from the past couple of years. If you take a look at the people who fell and they fell because of injury for whatever reason, if you have the ability to identify if they fell because of injury, see if they made NFL rosters at a higher percentage rate than typical 5th or 6th rounders or wherever they end up getting drafted, and see if people are overcautious about injury with regards to that, because that's what that would imply, right? And so I really like that idea, and I might take a look at that. Thank you, Bill, in terms of maybe a future article at The Athletic. But that's something that is fascinating because that I think also drives at this question, because now you can ask, are the injuries that people are worried about, do they correlate? And that's, I think, a more interesting version of an exploration of that question.
Yeah. Let's go to Grant, who asks, it seemed that the Vikings selected more players with good college production, good film, and good character, but maybe less athletic upside, especially along the defensive line. Do you think they did this due to the quarantine during the draft process or their current roster situation?
Well, I think the quarantine does impact things in a couple of ways. I think that one of them is that we didn't get the pro day, so we didn't have the ability to identify which players would be kind of those athletes. So that's a big part of it, is that you want to be able to figure out who they are before you have the ability to prioritize them in the draft process. But another part of it is that the Vikings, and this is what I was saying during the scouting recap when I was talking about Kenny Willekes, is that the Vikings emphasized character because they could not get a good bandwidth or a band of probabilities for what an outcome was for a character risk. So they couldn't say this guy is a character risk. We think he's likely or unlikely to kind of repeat some of the issues that he's had in his past. So we'll we'll avoid them or whatever. They treated everybody that has a potential character risk as a risk. So they were risk averse in that scenario, right? And as a result, they go towards the players that are the opposite of that kind of risk. And so they ended up getting like captains or whatever, right? they ended up getting players that were not necessarily that productive in college. I talked about how I thought Cameron Dancer was not actually all that productive on a play-by-play basis. They grabbed, again, DJ Wan and was not super productive. Troy Dye was productive. Obviously, James Lynch was productive. We talked about that. Justin Jefferson, crazy productive, but also a pretty good athlete. Ezra Cleveland, productive. But it's not like, Nate Stanley was a remarkably productive guy. They probably should have grabbed Anthony Gordon instead, especially from the viewpoint of production. So I don't know that they emphasize production a ton, but they certainly emphasize character much more than they typically do. And I think it's because of the quarantine.
Paul asks, which of the 3 quarterbacks sees the field first?
Oh, between the first-round draft picks? Joe Burrow.
Cornerbacks. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I was like, kind of weird question. That's fair. I think Jeff Gladney's got a job to lose, right? So I think that he clearly sees the field first. Plus, it's pretty clear that he picks up on defenses pretty quickly, so that's nice. And so there's a really good chance that they're just going to let him play it out. After that, I would be surprised to see Cameron Dantzler take the field right away. There's obviously a spot for him because, again, the Vikings cut so many corners or let them walk away in free agency. But I wouldn't be surprised if at the beginning of training camp it's somebody else playing there instead of him, just because there's not an indication that he's particularly good or bad at picking up defenses. And because Zimmer has had experiences with rookies not picking up defenses particularly quickly unless they've got kind of a reputation for it, I think that we've got a pretty good chance that the dancer is not going to see the field really quickly. And then the third corner is who? There's like 15 picks. I can't keep track of this.
Hold on. Harrison Hand.
Hand is fine. I think he's the least likely to see. I would go in draft order here. I think he's the least likely to see the field.
Cole asks, could you regrade the Diggs trade in terms of what the front office did with getting Jefferson and the other picks?
So I don't super love doing this because I think these trades should be kind of viewed in a vacuum. But to get like a context for this kind of trade, it's not like a terrible exercise. So take a look at what they got out of that. So obviously they got a first-round pick. That's Justin Jefferson. But they also got a future 4th-round pick. We don't know, obviously, what that's going to be. They got a 5th-round pick and a 6th-round pick. So that's the return. So Justin Jefferson, who did they pick with a 5th-round pick? They didn't pick anybody. They traded that away to the Chicago Bears for a future 4th. Okay, great. That means that they got 2 future 4ths and Justin Jefferson and a 6th. Okay, well, what did they do with the 6th? They didn't pick anybody with that. They traded that away to the Ravens, who picked James Prochet, somebody who I would have liked the Vikings to pick, honestly. And that was part of a package of picks where the Vikings also packaged the other 7th rounder in order to get a future 5th and a 7th round pick that they used on Kenny Willekes. So if we pretend that the 7th rounder they traded and the 7th rounder they got were the same, and that's Kenny Willekes, so they didn't actually have to package them together, or that's not part of the compensation, then you've got the 5th traded or the 6th traded for a future 5th. So what ends up happening with all of that is that they traded Justin Jefferson for a future 4th, another future 4th, and a future 5th. And that is a lot of things to acquire. I think that is pretty good. And they improved the return on the trade after having made the trade. So that's pretty cool to hear. Again, this is like, you can do that with any of your picks. You can turn any of your 3rd rounders into a future 2nd or whatever. So I don't want to say that the Diggs trade got you, Justin Jefferson and a future 4th and another future 4th and a future 5th. But it does look pretty good once it kind of all bears out. But we won't be able to, quote, fully grade, which again I don't like, because you don't know that that's what you're getting at the time until we know what the 2021 picks are, or if they keep doing this, the 2023 picks. Who knows?
Yeah. Don from Ohio asks, while the Vikings had a solid draft, isn't it likely the rookies will struggle this year due to restrictions the coronavirus is bringing to teams? Isn't it fair to say they won't be able to get acclimated to schemes / game plans / speed of game like other rookie draft classes? Yeah,
and I think it's important to remember rookies already struggle, which I know, Don, you're not saying that they don't. But I'm saying is that we always have too high expectations for rookies. Only 3 receivers last year got up to 800 yards, or were good enough to get 800 yards. I don't know how you'd qualify that. But one of Terry McLaurin or Deebo Samuel didn't hit it. So maybe you could say 4 receivers were instant hits because you had DK Metcalf and A.J. Brown also do well. So, okay, you've got those 4 receivers. They're the only receivers to do well. Only like one of them was a first-round pick. And that's more than you typically get, honestly. And so you have to think about that. So think about like the number of players that were selected at receiver last year and how many of them actually ended up contributing in a significant way as rookies. Now, maybe you've got a better receiver class, but you've got people that don't have the ability to practice in their team. So the Vikings will be sending game plans. Every team will be sending game plans to the rookies. They'll be sending playbooks, and they'll be working out independently. And Zimmer even mentioned that they've got the strength coach putting together videos on how you should work out with specific movements specific to that position and how that position operates in that offense. And there's going to be video coaching done to get people to run routes the right way and get that going. But it's not enough. It's just a stopgap. It's not going to get you to having familiarity, right? Like, Diggs knows that Cousins likes to throw the ball above eye level, where Michael Thomas knows that Drew Brees likes to throw the ball at eye level, right? And so they will modify their routes or put their hands in a spot that they're coming out the break in order to accommodate that. Kirk knows, well, I guess Diggs no longer has to worry about that. But Kirk knows that Adam Thielen likes the ball to come a little bit earlier than other receivers, right? And so he'll get rid of the ball a little bit earlier, right? And that is just something that they've worked on. They've got that kind of chemistry together, right? And then you've also got the ability to kind of correct people in real time. You don't get that, right? If you practice poorly, you are embedding in bad practice habits. And so you've got to be careful that you're not practicing too much, practicing too hard, because you might be practicing incorrect technique, and it's difficult to pick up, especially because coaches can't give individualized attention in the same way that they would in a live practice. So rookies might be harder to get in tune because they won't know the techniques. And it's very difficult. If you can't show people in real space what they should look like, and Zimmer's very hands-on when he's coaching defensive backs. He likes to put your, arm here and your hip here and all that. It's very difficult to get them to kind of know and feel what they should be doing. So I think that this is going to be a year where we're going to see down rookie performances for sure, which means I should probably accept the trade offers I keep getting in the Dynasty League that I haven't responded to. I'm a shit fantasy owner. Don't put me in your leagues. People were messaging me trades during the draft. I'm like, I don't have the time.
What of all times to message you about a trade in fantasy? Really?
Yeah, right. So I'm dealing with enough trades as it is. Jesus.
Josh asks, what does the 3 technique competition look like after the draft, and what do you expect the depth chart to look like there?
Yeah, that's going to be super interesting. So you've got, obviously, James Lynch, who they just drafted. They just signed Anthony Zettel. Shamar Stephen, who has the contract value to actually be the starter, but not a lot of people love him there except for the team, which is what matters. Then you've got Hercules Mataafa, Jalen Holmes, and then probably somebody else. Who knows? That's pretty interesting. I could not give you what I think the depth chart is going to be by the time week 1 is. I can tell you that at the beginning of training camp, if we have training camp, it's probably going to be Shamar Stephen on top. It's not like James Lynch was drafted high enough for him to just kind of get that spot. And then you also have to ask the question, is Jaleel Johnson just going to be a nose tackle forever? And I guess the case is yes. And then also Armin Watts, is he going to be a 3 technique or is he going to be a nose tackle? Because he played a lot of nose last year, even though he projects kind of as a 3 technique. So how is he going to break out by week 1? I'm a huge James Lynch guy, so I identified him as my sleeper in the Beat Writer Roundup. So I'll say he's going to take the majority of the snaps, which is not necessarily the same thing as starting, but I think that he's going to play a bigger role than anyone else. So that's what my guess is, and then my hope is that Hercules Mataafa can grab a meaningful rotational role.
Stizo asks, the NDSU quarterback is one of the hottest prospects for 2021. Is it realistic that Vikings target him in that draft? With all these extra picks already accumulated, they should have the capital to trade up.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I wish this guy would just throw an interception already. Good Lord. I hate him so much.
Aw.
And Minnesota was like, well, you can come, but you can't play quarterback. God, idiot. And okay, so Minnesota has an all-time recruiting class right now. Apparently, I don't know how meaningful that is at this point in the season. Like literally, I have no idea. But it's in the top 10. Maybe it's 6th or something. Great. They grab 2 dual threat quarterbacks. It's fun. But I'm still going to complain about this. Like, come on, just if you know that your guy has got a commitment at NDSU, you got to think about it, right? You got to be like, well. It'd be kind of embarrassing if we offered him and only let him play safety, huh?
Mm-hmm.
No. God, screw this guy, man.
Hunter
I can't believe he didn't throw an interception all year. That's impossible.
Yeah. Joe Justice asks, how many of these picks make the roster? Over, under 9.5?
Over, under 9.5. What a wild over, under. Like in a vacuum, obviously it makes sense here. So obviously the first 4 make the roster, no question about that, because they're first and second round picks. 4th rounders almost always make the roster. It's 1 out of every 100, so it's about 1 every 2 years. 4th rounders doesn't make the roster the rookie year. Fun fact, Willie Beavers was one of them. Just as an aside. So I would estimate that the Vikings are probably not going to be in a position to not let the 4th rounders make it. So you've got those 4 at the beginning, and then Wanham, Lynch, and Dyes. So that gives you 7. The over-under is 9.5. Out of the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounders, I'd estimate 1 of the 5ths and 1 of the 7ths, and then 1 extra one. Maybe that's a 6th, a 5th, or a 7th. So that's 10. Okay, yeah, I'll take the over.
Nice. Next question is from Real HG, who asks, this isn't Vikings related, but I've always wondered how contracts work for training camp guys. Most players are paid per game, right? But a camp guy who is cut before the season still gets something, right?
Yeah, so base salary is handed out to players who make the roster per game. The thing is, the contract they sign only applies to if they make the team. They earned their signing bonus, and every one of them gets a signing bonus. Some of them are as low as $5,000. The Vikings paid out a lot of signing bonus this year for Courtney Davis and Neville Clark. They get their signing bonus, so that's great. And then they get a training camp salary, which I think is determined by the CBA. Honestly, I don't have a ton of information on this, and I may have just said something wrong, but I'm pretty sure I've got this. What a great sentence. Where you get a biweekly salary during training camp, just as a matter of course. And I think it's the same for everybody. And then when the season starts, the contract that you signed is the one that kicks in. And so that's probably how that goes.
Zen Cupid asks, does Percy Harvin make it back to the NFL? And if so, which team is the best fit, or at least the most interesting?
The most interesting by far is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I do think he makes it back to the NFL because he was so electric at his peak. And it was a pretty great receiver class. It's not going to be a ton of places that have a spot for him. Unfortunately, one of those places is Green Bay because, again, they didn't draft a receiver. But yeah, Tampa Bay, clearly the most exciting place for him to go. You've got Mike Evans, you got Chris Godwin, you got Tom Brady. You've got what I assume is a running back with Keyshawn Vaughn. I did not like that pick. But they've got a great offensive line. They just invested in it even more with Tristan Wirfs. That's just good old fun, man. You can't not have fun there. Plus, Percy's back in Florida, his old stomping grounds. Man, that's probably not a good thing. Yeah. But it's Tallahassee. It's different. That's so fun. I love that idea. Someone was really pushing back on the idea that would be fun because I actually don't know what the reason is. But if Tom Brady can't throw the ball deep, he's throwing it to Percy, and Percy's just going to do Percy stuff. That's great. Somebody else said Arizona. That sounds fun as hell.
That sounds real
finally a quarterback as tall as him. Yeah. But no, you've got the air raid. You've got Fitz. You've got Hopkins. You've got Christian Kirk. Percy can play running back for them because they don't have one, which is smart. That sounds fun. Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. That's pretty fun. That's actually more boring, and I don't know why. It doesn't feel as fun anymore. But still, that seems like a really interesting, because you got, Hill over top. Percy can also play running back for them. You've got Andy Reid, who's obviously a genius. So you know how to use those guys. Plus Sammy Watkins, which is like what you would expect in college Percy would have been if he was good at route running. But yeah, I think that those are the teams that would be the most fun. But part of the reason that they're fun is that they don't necessarily need a receiver. And so the best fit, at least from a team perspective, is somebody like the Packers, who did not invest in a receiver. Or maybe the Seahawks. I don't know if the Seahawks drafted a receiver, but having him with I don't know if you'd go back to the Seahawks after he punched out the team, but he would probably be a good fit, right? They could probably use another receiver next to DK Metcalf. Who they draft?
I think the Chiefs thing is. I think the reason why the Chiefs thing doesn't seem as fun is simply because of their recent success. You want
they drafted Freddie Swain?
Yeah.
Who the hell is that? Okay. Yeah, no, that might be it. Is that we got kind of tired of it. It's no one talks about how exciting the McVay offense is anymore because, well, A, it got worse, but B, it was just yeah, all right, we get it.
Yeah. All right, next.
I didn't even think about it. Baltimore. Duh. Okay,
Ooh.
Most fun is Baltimore. Done. End of discussion.
That is interesting.
And they need a receiver.
They do. Huh. Let's hope he doesn't listen to that one. He did say recently, I think in his interviews with I forget if it was The Athletic or if it was his interviews with Master, where he had talked about the most fun and he wished he'd never left was Minnesota. So there is that.
And so this is the thing, so I talked about how interesting Percy was, and somebody was like, yeah, but he was an asshole. And I was like, well, yeah, that's part of yeah, we know. I don't want assholes on my team. And I was like, okay, so you clearly didn't listen to the interviews. He came off so contrite and apologetic, and he put it all on himself. And I thought, that was really big of him. And I thought he had an understanding of everything that was happening in his life that kind of pushed him in those directions, and he found ways to kind of improve himself. So I'm very happy with how comfortable he is with himself, and it's very clearly he understood, what had gone wrong, and a lot of it was him, and so it's not the same as getting Minnesota Percy.
Well, yes. Next question, Beef Brewski asks, which player will be the biggest surprise of this draft class for the Vikings?
That's 15 again. Jesus. I'm not complaining that you asked about the Vikings draft class on a Vikings pod right after the draft, but I am complaining about it. The biggest surprise. So if I take James Lynch off the board because he's the guy that I really liked on day 3, and I'm left with Wanham and Dye and Hand and Osborne, Brandel, Medalis, Willikis, and the 7th rounders, I would say either Willikis, who, again, I like a lot because he was super productive, or Kyle Hinton because he's super athletic. We'll see. I mean, picking a surprise by nature is difficult because it's expecting the unexpected.
Next question is also from Beef Brewski, who asks, more TDs this season, Irv Smith Jr. or Justin Jefferson?
Oh, I like that. That's a genuinely good question. I like that. Tight ends are one of the few positions in the NFL where the learning curve is 2 years. There's a recent PFF study on learning curves that's really good. I'll link it in the show notes. But they're one of the few positions in the NFL that has a learning curve of 2 years. I think tackle is another one. And receivers have a short learning curve, maybe even half a year. But it's typically 1 year. And so you've got that kind of, they're both technically outside of the window where they're about to go off, right? Jefferson was a remarkable touchdown producer with 18 touchdowns last year in an offense designed to produce touchdowns. They're 50, right? Irv Smith was on an offense that was designed to produce touchdowns and produced a ton of touchdowns, but he did not get as many. That would tell me, at least with only those pieces of information in mind, that Jefferson has got more potential to produce touchdowns I don't know if you can do it as a rookie. I'll still say Jefferson. I like Smith a lot, but I think that the fact that Kyle Rudolph is crowding him out at the red zone and that he didn't necessarily put it all together right away, and that there's basically an open spot for Jefferson makes it easier for Jefferson not just to get more snaps and more valuable snaps because he's a receiver, but just better opportunities even in the red zone.
All right, next question. Well, this is also going to be from Beef Brewski. Arif, you, much like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the vaunted cinematic classic Junior, are pregnant and about to give birth in the Vikings locker room. Which player do you ask to hold your hand, and which player talks you through it, and which player guides the baby out?
Holy crap.
I don't have a good response to this. In fact, my response was a GIF to him.
First I got to decide who holds my hand.
I was going to say, congratulations. You may have actually made it so that Arif is speechless.
See, if Teddy was still on the team, he'd be the one holding my hand. No question, honestly. I have to think about like which players like fathers and stuff. I think that's important for this exercise. And
Kirk is going to deliver that baby. You're not going to be able to stop him.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Is there any player on the team I would trust more to have done all the research? Probably not. So Kirk delivers the baby. Who's holding my hand? Man, Stephen Weatherly's not on the team anymore. That would be hilarious. I don't know if I want hilarious, but that would be hilarious. Man.
Linval would have been good for holding your hand.
God, but I don't want to lose my hand.
No, that'd be Adrian.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Man, who seems like they'd be like kind and sympathetic enough to guide me through the process, but like wouldn't make it weird afterwards, at least any weirder than it already is.
Weirder than it already is.
I think Dalvin, he's a good guy.
Yeah. He's elusive. So he's not going to,
Yeah, if he needs to avoid me, he's already great at avoiding me in the locker room. He's remarkable at it, honestly. So there's that. And then, the last one was like talking me through and guiding the process, right?
Yeah.
Man. This is where I would pick somebody like George Aloka or Terrence Newman if they were on the team. Like they seem like they'd be perfect for that.
A nice seasoned vet.
Yeah. But like relatively even tempered, right? Like, so I can't, if Everson was on the team, I don't want to be hyped up, right? I'm already hyped up. Eric Kendricks. Okay. Yeah.
There you go. Get the UCLA guy in there. Hey, we talked about this last episode, and this is the second chapter of this. Andy Sherman. Okay, in my last email, I talked about this time traveler telling Rick Spielman about the future. You probably already talked about it in the past episode, but this time traveler, panting from the disorientation of time travel, shakes Spielman out of his sleep on the night of April 22nd and shrieks, "You have to get as many picks as possible." Spielman shrugs and says, "I was going to do that anyway," and rolls over. Then turning back to the time traveler, a last time, Spielman says, "Just out of curiosity, why were you recommending the picks anyway? What unexpected twist does the time traveler say after the cliffhanger commercial break?"
I was going to do that anyway. Probably that the season's canceled, right?
Yeah.
Because then he's turning those picks into future picks. But the time traveler would just say future picks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. But he said it with like a lot of urgency. Like it sounds like it's more than football. It sounds like there's like lives in the balance, right?
You have to think that the time traveler really should have come back to say, "By the way, you're not going to believe what Green Bay just did." You're not.
Yeah. You have to get as many picks as possible. Like, can you imagine somebody like goes back in time and shakes you out of your sleep? You're the general manager of the Vikings, and they shakes you out of your sleep. You have to get as many picks as possible. And you, the general manager of the Vikings, are already familiar with this time traveler, so you're not like worried how you like broke into your house or whatever, right? And they say it with such urgency, and their answer is, "Oh, there's going to be 7 Pro Bowlers coming out of the 7th round." Like that doesn't match like the urgency, right? Like it just doesn't fit And apparently it disorients them to time travel, right? Like it takes something out of them. But like,
if you're going to do that, you have to do the Back to the Future thing and accidentally drop the sports almanac.
Yeah, right. But like anything more urgent, he probably should just say that instead of acquire future picks, right? Or acquire as many picks as possible. And it's not like something like really morbid, right? Like it's not like, when the draft picks, come to the Vikings, the plane that they'll be on will crash. So you need to get as many picks as possible. So there's going to be 2 planes, so half of them survive. Because you just be like, don't fly them here. Like that's what you say, right? Like I can't think of. I think it's just basically that there's not going to be a season, so you need to have future picks, or there's not going to be a season. It's going to stunt everybody's development, so you got to take as many shots as you can. But it just does not match the urgency with which this guy is like traveling through time. Also, Spielman didn't hire this guy. I thought we agreed in the last episode that he hired this guy.
Yeah. So if he didn't hire him, maybe it's a situation like in Watchmen where like, oh, you have to have this. Why? Well, because there's going to be a giant squid that takes out New York and there's going to be like millions of people. Like, okay. So that I don't understand how that affects the draft, but that's interesting. Sure. Great.
You need to grab as many picks as possible and get people into the state of Minnesota because that's the only safe state. Like, are draft picks really the most efficient way to get refugees in here? That's weird.
Yeah, sure. Why not? Finally, Luke Braun asks, help me find a good go-to quarantine dinner recipe that's a fun way to blow off an afternoon, but doesn't require ingredients you'd usually have to order from like Zimbabwe and now would have no chance of getting access to.
Oh, I mean, like any stew or braise. So we've made a lot of beef bolognese. You should have most of the ingredients already, and if you don't, they're easily accessible. Canned tomatoes, obviously ground beef, maybe some ground pork for variety, onions, garlic. I mean, it's bolognese, but if you cook it over like 3 or 4 hours, it gets really good. And so I would recommend that. There's a couple of really great recipes online. Serious Eats has a really good one that we've been using. Or a braise. We've done some short rib braises that have been just killer. Beef bourguignon is really good. Beef burgundy, where you basically just stew a tough piece of beef in wine for like 12 hours, and then you add in like some sautéed mushrooms and pearl onions at the end. That's really delicious, and it takes a lot of time, but it's also really easy, and all the ingredients are easy, except for pearl onions, but they're actually better frozen anyway, so you can just grab those in the frozen section. They're usually available. So, you need access to like wine, but I don't know if wine stores are closed where you are. They're for some reason not closed in a bunch of places. So, I think just stews or braises. Look up stews on Serious Eats.
I ended up doing something recently that I really liked, which was I ended up making a kind of a potato ham soup. It was a bunch of potatoes, a yellow onion, 2 large carrots, some chopped celery, some cubed ham that I put together, a little bit of kosher salt, some pepper, a little bit of flour, 4 cups of chicken broth, 1.5 cups of heavy cream, and a little bit of sour cream, and that's it. And those are most things that you should have around the house other than, maybe a vegetable or 2 or maybe the ham. But I ended up putting that in the crock pot for, I want to say 6 hours. And you add the flour near the end to kind of thicken it up. But otherwise, it was just so good. You had the cream, the heavy cream, the sour cream, and the flour at the end. And man, that was so delicious. And I had 4 kids who don't like soup asking for seconds. So I enjoyed it, and apparently it was also enjoyed by others. So that would be my recommendation. Just a simple little thing there. All right, Arif, we've made it to the end of the episode. I'd ask what do you have to plug, but you're kind of everywhere right now.
Yeah, just head over to The Athletic. I'm sure half of that stuff was written by me.
At this point, it's entirely possible. All right, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you enjoyed it. we will be back soon, hopefully with more football content, or we're just going to mess around for a while because we're waiting for any sort of news to happen about what's going to happen in the fall. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for sticking around and listening to the episode, and we'll be back soon, and please remember to bring your wine towel. We'll see you soon. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.